the hidden meaning, who the Tuatha Dé Danann really is? This question echoes down through the centuries, not as a simple query about a mythological race, but as a deeper investigation into how memory itself is formed. They are, even now, the people of the goddess Danu, a name that whispers of a vast divine lineage, yet the texts present them as kings and queens, as warriors of flesh and blood who arrived on a specific shore at a specific time. This paradox is their essence. They are the central mystery of Irish legend, simultaneously ancestors and gods, historical figures, and the embodiment of the land's magic. To ask who they are is to look at the green, rain-swept hills of Ireland and see not just geology, but sleeping palaces. They represent a sophisticated attempt by a culture in transition, the moment pagan Ireland was baptized, but not broken, to preserve its ancient soul within a new story. They are the living memory of a vanquished pantheon, a divine family downgraded by history into nobility, yet who refuse to stop shining with the light of their original power. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. As we settle in to trace their path, we must first travel not to Ireland, but to the minds of the men who preserved their story. Our primary source for this epic journey is a remarkable text, the Liber Gabála Éireann, or the Book of the Takings of Ireland, compiled by Christian monks in the medieval period, primarily around the 11th century. These scribes were academics, theologians, and poets, and they faced a profound intellectual and spiritual dilemma. The island they lived on was saturated with the stories of these magnificent beings, figures who controlled the harvest, who moved with divine grace, and who waged wars with elemental power. These were the gods of their ancestors, the fabric of their native culture, yet they now served a single, jealous god from the Middle East. They could not simply eradicate these tales. The Tuatha Dé Danann were too deeply woven into the identity of the people and the very names of the rivers, mountains, and great ceremonial mounds that dominated the landscape. Their solution was an act of profound, creative historiography, a process scholars now refer to as euhemerism. They chose not to record the Tuatha Dé Danann as gods, which would be heresy, nor to dismiss them as demons, which would dishonor their own heritage. Instead, they cleverly demoted them. The monks presented the Tuatha Dé Danann as a historical wave of invaders, the fourth of 5 great migrations to settle Ireland. They were portrayed as an ancient race of humans, perhaps from a distant, unidentified part of Greece or Scythia, who were simply mortals of extraordinary skill. Their magic was reframed as superlative knowledge, advanced science, profound artistry, and a deep understanding of the natural world that to a lesser people would seem divine. This brilliant compromise allowed the monks to save the stories, preserving the entire narrative cycle by fitting it neatly into a biblical, linear chronology that began, as all good histories did, with Noah and the flood. Yet this careful categorization, this academic tidying, could not fully contain the power of the originals. The divinity bleeds through the edges of the vellum. These mortals perform acts that no mortal could. Their leaders are not just kings, they are personifications of abundance, like the Dagda, the good god, whose cauldron of plenty never runs empty. Their women are not just queens, they are the sovereign spirit of the land itself, like Eriu, who gives her very name to the island, Air. This tension, this deliberate blurring of lines, is where the true story lies. We are reading a mythology that has been deliberately disguised as a history. The Tuatha Dé Danann are the echoes of the pan-Celtic gods seen elsewhere in Europe, the figures worshipped by the Gauls and the Britons before the Roman eagles silenced their groves. In the Irish texts, protected by the island's isolation, these figures survived, albeit in costume. We are therefore engaging in a kind of textual archaeology, looking for the faint outlines of the original gods beneath the robes of medieval kings and queens. And the monks, in their wisdom, left us clues. They tied these historical invaders to the most ancient, sacred, and visibly non-human structures in their world, the great Neolithic passage tombs of the Boyne Valley. Bruna Boyne, Newgrange, a stone structure built 5,000 years ago, millennia before any Celt arrived, was claimed in the Liber Gabála as the personal palace of the Dagda. The monks were, in essence, grafting their newly recorded history onto the deepest archaeological roots they knew, claiming a continuity of sacredness from the Stone Age dawn to the Christian present, with the Tuatha Dé Danann as the crucial, shining link. So as we begin their story, we must hold this dual nature in our minds. We are following a people who are both profoundly human in their passions, their jealousies, and their sorrows, and profoundly divine in their power over the elements and their connection to the fate of the land. They are the ultimate expression of the Irish mythological mind, a space where poetry is as real as physics, where a perfectly crafted phrase can win a battle, and where the border between this world and the other world is as thin as river mist. Their journey begins not in Ireland itself, but far from its shores, in a shadowy, fog-bound realm to the north, a place of pure learning. It was here, in 4 shining, mysterious cities, that this displaced people, this tribe of gods in waiting, first mastered the skills that would define their destiny and arm them for the conquest of the island that waited for them. Sleeping in the Western Sea, before the Tuatha Dé Danann were the masters of Ireland, they were wanderers, a displaced nobility seeking a home and a purpose, their lineage stretching back into the shadowy genealogies compiled by the medieval monks, connecting them to earlier, failed settlements of the island. The Liber Gabála Érenn suggests they are descendants of Nemed, a figure whose people had previously settled Ireland only to be scattered by plagues and the oppression of the monstrous Fomorians. This narrative thread establishes the Tuatha not as alien invaders, but as a people returning to a lost homeland, a rightful inheritance they were now equipped to reclaim. Their journey, therefore, begins in an enigmatic northern realm, a place the texts call Inis Doireann, the Isle of Doorposts, or perhaps the Isle of the North, a location that defies any simple placement on a human map. It was a region of mist, existing more in the realm of symbolic geography than in the physical world, a place where the borders between worlds were thin and knowledge was the primary currency. Here, in the deep, quiet isolation of the boreal fog, they found 4 great cities, places that functioned less as centers of commerce and more as divine universities, the spiritual academies of the ancient world. These cities were named Phalius, Gorius, Murius, and Phineus, and they rose from the landscape like beacons of specialized wisdom. Each city was governed by a master sage, a Dierui of immense power and learning, who had plumbed the depths of a particular aspect of existence. These sages were not mere teachers. They were the living repositories of the arts that separated the divine from the mundane, and they recognized in the Tuatha Dé Danann the potential for mastery. The TDD did not come as conquerors to these cities, but as students, settling among these sages for a period of intense tutelage, their societal structure suggesting a deep reverence for crafted skill and intellectual prowess. This period of learning is central to their identity, for they are, above all, the people of Dan, the Irish word for art, skill, or craft. They sought not just power, but a complete understanding of the cosmos, from the forging of a perfect sword to the turning of a perfect verse, believing each to be a reflection of the same divine order. In the city of Phalias, which means shadow or veiled, they studied under the sage Morfessa. Here, they learned the arts of kingship and the deep magic of the land itself. Morfessa taught them feasts, or seeing, the art of divination, how to read the patterns of bird flight, the currents of the wind, and the silent omens written in the earth. They learned that a true king must be physically perfect, a symbolic mirror of a perfect and balanced kingdom, and that their authority would come not from brute force, but from a mystical contract with the land they hoped to rule. From Gorius, the fiery or glowing city, the sage Ezras taught them the unyielding nature of truth and the focus of righteous battle. They learned strategy, the mathematics of conflict, and the moral weight of the warrior's code, understanding the spear not just as a weapon to kill, but as an instrument of judgment that could not be turned from its true mark. The third city, Phineas, the white or clear city, was the domain of the sage Witius, the watery, who taught them the mastery of eloquence and the irresistible power of clarity. Here they learned the laws, the judging of disputes, and the understanding that true victory came not just from defeating an enemy, but from establishing a just and lasting peace. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they came to Murias, the city of the sea, or walled city, which lay to the south. Here the sage Semias presided over the mysteries of life, abundance, and community. He taught the TDD the arts of healing, the cycles of agriculture, the secrets of the smith's forge, and the bonds of hospitality that hold a society together. They learned that a kingdom could not survive on victories alone. It needed sustenance, joy, and the magical craft of the Liaig, the healer, and the Goibnu, the smith, to mend what was broken, whether it be a body or a tool. This comprehensive education in statecraft, warfare, justice, and sustenance created a perfectly balanced society. They were not a rough tribe of warriors. They were a collective of specialists, a pantheon in training, where the poet was as vital as the champion and the healer as revered as the king. This mythology of education almost certainly reflects the historical reality of the sophisticated tripartite structure of Celtic society, which was divided among the Druids, the sacred and legal scholars, represented by Phalius and Phineas, the warriors, represented by Gorius, and the farmers and artisans, represented by Murias. The Tuatha Dé Danann, in their northern education, were becoming the idealized expression of this very social structure. The historical mystery of these four cities has long intrigued scholars. Are they a folk memory of distant, real centers of trade and learning, Perhaps Hellenistic cities like Alexandria, whose reputation for knowledge echoed even to the farthest northern isles? Or are they, as many suspect, a purely symbolic map of the Tuatha Dé Danann's own divine nature, representing the four cardinal directions or the four elements from which they drew their comprehensive power? The texts remain beautifully ambiguous, allowing the cities to exist in that space between history and dream. As the Tuatha Dé Danann completed their studies, their education now perfected, they prepared to leave this northern sanctuary. They would not go empty-handed. From each of the four great cities, their masters gave them a parting gift, a single, transcendent artifact that was the physical embodiment of the knowledge they had gained. These four treasures, which they would carry with them to their new home, would become the ultimate symbols of their right to rule, the physical proof of their divine and intellectual mandate, as they finally turned their gaze south toward the green island that was their destiny. From the mists of the northern cities they journeyed, a silent armada, moving not with the visible effort of oar and sail, but as a gliding, cohesive will. The Tuatha Dé Danann, having mastered the highest arts of the known world, now carried that knowledge and its four physical embodiments southward across the cold, open sea. The chronicles of the monks, in their meticulous effort to anchor this event in human history, tell us they made landfall on the 1st of May, the high festival of Beltane, a date already ancient and pulsing with supernatural significance, the traditional start of the summer half of the year. They arrived not at a welcoming port, but on the wild, stone-strewn coastline of Conmacnamara, a place we now call Connemara in County Galway, a landscape of breathtaking desolation, of bog and granite facing the vast, indifferent Atlantic. Their arrival was an event that defied the known laws of nature, an act of such profound magic that it was immediately written into the annals of the land itself. The Labor Gabala Aaron insists they did not come in the manner of mortal voyagers. There were no fleets of wooden boats rowing for the shore, no anchors dropped in the churning surf. Instead, the texts state they arrived in Sheithaib Dorchaib, in dark clouds, or perhaps more poetically, in clouds of darkness. They descended from the sky, carried on the same mists that had shrouded their northern academies, and landed upon the mountains of the west coast. This was not a landing, it was a materialization. With this act, they obscured the very sun. For 3 days and 3 nights, an unnatural, magical darkness fell over Ireland, a profound eclipse that was not of the heavens, but of the earth. The air grew thick and silent, the new arrivals concealing their presence from the island's current inhabitants, the Fir Bolg. This supernatural fog, a strategic tool of concealment, was also a powerful statement of their nature. They were a people who commanded the elements, who could bend the sky to their will, and who arrived not as petitioners, but as a new and undeniable reality. This detail of the dark clouds is a moment of pure mythological power, but the medieval historians, ever the rationalists, sought to ground it. They calculated that a significant solar eclipse was visible in Ireland around the time they had designated for this arrival, and so, for them, the myth was validated as history, a folk memory of a real celestial event, when the moon devoured the sun and plunged the world into a terrifying, premature night. Yet another, equally powerful tradition, recorded in the Cathmage Tuired, offers a different and more tangible image, one that speaks less of divine descent and more of human resolve. This version states that the Tuatha Dé Danann did arrive in ships, a great fleet that crossed the northern sea. But the moment their feet touched the Irish soil, the moment they had unloaded their 4 sacred treasures onto the shore, they turned, and by a common, unshakable accord, they set fire to their own fleet. This act is one of the most resonant in their entire story. We can almost smell the acrid smoke of the burning oak and hide, a vast column of black and gray rising into the clean salt air, a self-made cloud to rival the supernatural mists. It was a declaration, both to the land they now stood upon and to themselves. This was not an expedition. It was an immigration. This was not a raid from which they might later retreat. It was the final, unchangeable claiming of a home. By burning their ships, the Tuatha Dé Danann consciously and deliberately destroyed their only means of escape. They severed their past, erasing the path back to the northern cities, and in doing so, they staked their entire future, their very existence, on the land that lay before them. It was the ultimate commitment, an act of terrifying, unified faith in their own destiny, a promise that they would either conquer this island or they would perish upon its soil. There would be no retreat. These 2 stories, of the dark clouds and the burning ships, are not necessarily in conflict. They simply illuminate different facets of the Tuatha's truth. One speaks to their otherworldly, divine origin, their power over the elements, their connection to the sky itself. The other speaks to their profound, almost human determination, their warrior's spirit, and their absolute commitment to the land. The monks who compiled the histories clearly favored the burning of the ships, as it painted the Tuatha Dé as a heroic, historical people, a noble race of ancestors. But the folk memory, the older magic, perhaps held onto the image of the descending mist, the gods who arrived like a weather front, undeniable and awesome. When the 3 days of darkness finally lifted, or when the last of the great ships had collapsed into embers on the strand, the Fir Bolg, the farmers and warriors who had ruled Ireland, looked west and saw them. There, standing silent on the shore, were the newcomers, tall and fair, their weapons gleaming with a strange light, the very air around them seeming to hum with a knowledge and a power the island had never known. The land was now contested, and the first chapter of their new life was about to be written in blood. As the smoke from their burning fleet stained the western sky, the Tuatha Dé Danann stood upon the shore not as refugees, but as a new and complete authority, and they brought with them the physical proof of their divine mandate. These were the 4 great treasures, the hallows of Ireland, which they had carried from the 4 northern cities of their tutelage. These were not mere tools or weapons. They were symbiotic extensions of their power, the living symbols of the 4 pillars upon which their new kingdom would be built. Each artifact was a physical manifestation of the knowledge they had mastered, a gift from the sage of each city, and a permanent covenant between their people and the forces of the cosmos. They were the instruments of their legitimacy, tangible proofs of their connection to a wisdom deeper than any the island had yet known. From the city of Phalius, the city of kingly craft, ruled by the sage Morfessa, they brought the Lugh file, the stone of destiny. This was not a carved jewel, but a rough, potent block of standing stone, seemingly unworked yet humming with the latent energy of the earth itself. It was the ultimate arbiter of sovereignty, possessing a consciousness of its own. Its purpose was singular and absolute. It was said to cry out with a high, human-like shriek when the true Ard Rí, the rightful High King of Ireland, placed his feet upon it. This was not a simple coronation, it was an agreement. The stone was the voice of the land, Éire herself, and its cry was the land's acceptance of the king, a mystical contract binding the ruler to the soil, ensuring that his reign would be just, fertile, and true. To rule without the stone's approval was to be a mere usurper. The Tuatha Dé, in bringing this stone, were not just bringing a kingmaker, they were bringing the very concept of a sacred earth-sanctioned monarchy. This artifact, more than any other, has haunted the historical imagination. It remains the great, open mystery of the Hill of Tara, the ancient seat of the High Kings. A lichen-covered standing stone, the Anforas Fiasa, still stands upon that windy hill today, a silent monument that tradition claims is the very stone, though its voice has not been heard, the legends say, since the dawn of the Christian era, its magic muted by a new faith. From Gorius, the fiery city of the sage Esras, they carried the Clayomche Soleis, the sword of light. This was the personal weapon of their king, Nuada, and it was a masterpiece of the divine smith's art, but its true power was not in its edge, but in its essence. When drawn from its sheath, it was said that no one could escape from it, nor could any armor withstand it. It shone with a light so brilliant and terrible that it was compared to a captured sunbeam or a sliver of lightning. It was the symbol of Esdras' teaching, the irresistible, unyielding power of truth and righteous judgment. It was a weapon that could not be wielded in a lie or for an unjust cause, for its light would expose the corruption. In Nuada's hand, it was the physical guarantee of victory, an instrument not of murder, but of divine adjudication. To face the sword of light was to face the pure, unblinking concept of justice, and it would become the symbol of the TDD's military and moral supremacy in the wars to come. From the southern city of Murias, the place of abundance taught by the sage Semias, they brought a gift that spoke not of war or kingship, but of life itself, the choir Dagde, the cauldron of the Dagda. This vast vessel, hammered from an unknown magical metal, was the archetype of plenty, the source of all sustenance. It was said that no company ever went away from it unsatisfied, for it held an inexhaustible supply of food, always perfectly cooked, always exactly what the diner most desired. It was more than a magical feeding trough. It was the symbol of sacred hospitality, the binding force of Celtic society. It represented the king's obligation to provide for his people, the guarantee of fertility in the land, and the communal joy that holds a tribe together. This cauldron, which would be entrusted to their great good god, the Dagda, resonates through all of Celtic mythology, the clear precursor to the Welsh cauldron of Bran, and some scholars hypothesize a deep cultural root for the later medieval legends of the Holy Grail, a vessel of endless spiritual and physical nourishment. Finally, from Phineas, the clear city of the sage Wisius, they brought the most terrible and uncontrollable of the treasures, the spear, while later traditions would tie it inextricably to their greatest champion, Lugh. It arrived with them as an artifact of pure, focused power. unlike the sword, this spear was not just. It was simply effective. It was alive, a roaring spear that thirsted for battle so intensely that its fiery, blood-seeking head had to be kept submerged in a vat of water, or, as some texts suggest, a potion of poppy seeds to keep it asleep. If unleashed, it would tear free from its wielder's grip, fly through the air of its own accord, and never miss its mark, slaughtering its way through ranks of enemies before returning, sated, to its master's hand. It was the embodiment of Uishias's teaching, the perfect, clear, and terrifying application of will and inevitable victory. These four objects, the stone of the land, the sword of justice, the cauldron of life, and the spear of victory, were now on Irish soil. They defined the Tuatha Dé Danann's very nature, and as they advanced inland from the coast, these treasures radiated a power that the incumbent Fir Bolg, watching in growing fear, could not hope to match. With their ships reduced to a line of cooling embers on the western shore, and their four sacred treasures secured, the Tuatha Dé Danann began their inevitable advance inland, a silent, graceful column moving through the rough boglands and stony hills of Connemara. They moved with a purpose that was almost unnerving, a society of artists, smiths, and scholars arrayed for war. It was not long before they were discovered. The incumbent rulers of the island, the Fir Bolg, a sturdy, dark-haired people who had long known the toil of agriculture and the burden of kingship, received word from their scouts. These reports described the invaders in mythic terms. They were tall, fair-skinned, and luminously beautiful, moving with a grace that seemed inhuman, and their weapons and armor gleamed with a light that was not, the scouts insisted, simple sunlight on polished metal. The king of the Fir Bolg, Eochaid mac Éirc, a ruler renowned for his commitment to justice, felt a cold dread settle over his court. This was not a familiar border skirmish. This was a challenge to their very existence. The two groups, the old rulers and the new, advanced toward a fated meeting place. The texts, our only guide to this epic confrontation, tell us they met upon a great plain in the west, a site that would forever after be known as Mag Tuired, the Plain of Towers, or Plain of Pillars, a name suggesting a landscape already ancient, perhaps dotted with the standing stones of even older, forgotten peoples. The plain was located near the modern border of counties Galway and Mayo, a wide, open stage for the drama that was to unfold. But this was not an immediate, savage clash. The narrative, as recorded in the Caith Mage Tuired, insists on a period of negotiation, a reflection of the deep-seated Celtic and later Irish legal tradition of Brehon law, where diplomacy and the stating of terms were a necessary prelude to any just war. The TDD, in a display of what they saw as fairness, sent an envoy to King Eochaid. They offered a stark choice: surrender half of the island, and the two peoples could live in peace, side by side, or refuse and settle the matter with the sword. King Eochaid and his chieftains were proud. They had toiled to make Ireland their own, and the Fir Bolg, whose name may mean the men of bags, a possible folk memory of an earlier enslavement, in Greece where they carried bags of earth, were not inclined to give up half their hard-won home to these beautiful, terrifying strangers who had descended from the sky. They chose war. But even in this, there was a sense of profound, shared ritual. The two armies agreed to a truce, a cooling off period to allow both sides to prepare. For 15 days, the strange silence on the plain was broken by the sound of industry. The TDD's smiths and the Firbolg's smiths alike were heard hammering, sharpening blades, and mending shields, a mutual, respectful preparation for the slaughter to come. During this time, the champions of each side would meet, almost as colleagues, to inspect one another's craftsmanship. The Firbolg champions noted with fear that the TDD's spears were slender and sharp-pointed, a new and deadly technology, while the TDD noted that the Firbolgs were thick-handled and heavy, built for strength rather than the finesse they so valued. Finally, the truce ended, and the battle began. It was not a single chaotic melee, but a long, grinding war of champions that lasted for 4 days. On the first day, the champions fought, and the battle was a draw, the field darkened by the flight of their javelins. On the second and third days, the TDD's superior skill and subtle magic began to tell. Their warriors moved with a speed and precision the Firbolg could not match, and their enchanted weapons found their marks. Yet the Firbolg fought with the desperate, unyielding strength of a people defending their homes, and their greatest champion, Shreng, was a match for any warrior the TDD could field. On the fourth and final day, the two kings met in the center of the fray. Eochaid mac Airk, the king of the Firbolg, fell, his reign ending in the mud of the battlefield. But the true climax of the day, the moment that would alter the TDD's own destiny, was the duel between Shreng and Nuada, the High King of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Nuada wielded his irresistible sword of light, the treasure from Gorias, but Shreng was a master of his own heavy blade. In a furious exchange, as Nuada overextended, Shreng brought his massive broadsword down, not in a killing blow, but in a devastating strike that sheared clean through Nuada's shield and his right arm, severing it from his body at the shoulder. The king fell, screaming, and the battle halted in shock. The TDD had won the field. The Firbolg were broken, their king slain, their army in tatters. But the TDD had suffered an unthinkable, symbolic wound. Their king, the wielder of the Sword of Light, was now maimed. The battle was over, but the victory was profoundly bitter. In the aftermath, the TDD showed a victor's mercy, one that was also deeply pragmatic. They were so impressed by the courage and honor of Shreng and the remaining Firbolg that they renewed their original offer. Shreng, now leading his people, was wise enough to accept. The Firbolg were granted their choice of one of the 5 provinces of Ireland to be their own. They chose Connaught, the rugged, beautiful, and wild province of the west, the very place the TDD had landed. The Firbolg retreated to these lands, and for a time there was peace. The Tuatha Dé Danann were now the undisputed masters of the island, but as they gathered to celebrate their victory, their eyes kept turning to their fallen king, bleeding on his shield, a man whose wound was far more than a physical injury. It was a constitutional crisis. The cries of victory on the plain of Mag Tuired faded into a profound and troubled stillness as the Tuatha Dé Danann gathered around their fallen leader. The great Firbolg champion Shreng had been merciful in his own way, offering a truce when he could have pressed his advantage against the reeling, kingless army. But that mercy only highlighted the catastrophe that had unfolded. Nuada lay upon his shield, his face pale and etched with a pain that went far beyond the physical trauma. His right arm, the arm that had wielded the Clayomage Soleis, the very sword of light that was the symbol of their divine justice, was gone, severed at the shoulder, a brutal, undeniable absence. The Tuatha healers, the most skilled liage in the world, rushed to his side, stemming the flow of blood with potent herbs and whispered charms, their faces grim. They could save his life, but they could not restore what was lost, and in that loss, the very foundation of their newly conquered kingdom had fractured. For the Tuatha Dé Danann, this was not merely a grievous wound to a beloved commander. It was a constitutional and spiritual crisis of the highest order. Their entire philosophy of rule, the sacred knowledge they had learned in the city of Phalius, was built upon a single, unyielding principle, the law of physical perfection. The king, the Ard Ri, was not just a political leader or a military general. He was the living embodiment of the land itself, a divine conduit through which the health and sovereignty of the nation flowed. His body was a microcosm of the kingdom. If the king was whole, unblemished, and perfect, the land would be fertile, the harvests abundant, the cows heavy with milk, and the rivers full of fish. His perfection guaranteed the fes ein ingene, the ruler's truth, and the land responded to his wholeness with its own. Conversely, a king who was maimed, blemished, or physically imperfect, however wise or brave, was a living invitation to disaster. His imperfection would be mirrored in the kingdom as blight on the corn, sickness in the cattle, and barrenness in the people. This ancient law was absolute, as cold and unyielding as the Leophile itself, the stone that now sat silent, unable to cry out for a maimed ruler. It was a concept that transcended personal loyalty or battlefield heroism. Nuada, by losing his arm, in the very act of winning the kingdom, had by that same act made himself ineligible to rule it. The irony was devastating, a bitter draught for a victorious people to swallow. He had paid for their new home with his own sovereignty. As the chieftains and sages of the TDD convened their first council on the soil of Ireland, it was not to celebrate their victory or to divide the spoils of war. It was to face the dreadful legal necessity of their king's abdication. There was no debate, no factional argument. The law was the law, the central pillar of their Don, their sacred skill. To ignore it would be to invalidate their entire claim to the island, to prove themselves no better than the unlearned furbolg they had just displaced. We can only imagine the sorrow in that assembly, a quiet, respectful tragedy unfolding as Nuada, his wound bound, would have been forced to formally relinquish his crown. He had led his people from the misty northern cities. He had masterminded the seamless arrival, and he had commanded them on the field of battle, yet he could no longer sit upon the throne. The sword of light, now masterless, was returned to its sheath, its brilliant judicial glow dimmed in the absence of a perfect hand to hold it. This moment reveals the deep, almost impersonal nature of the TDD's worldview. The system, the divine order, was more important than any single individual, even the king himself. Nuada became Nuada of the silver arm in that moment, but first he was simply Nuada the Mamd, a man disqualified from his own destiny. His abdication left a terrifying void. The throne was empty. The Tuatha Dé were a new power in a strange land, their victory still fresh and perhaps fragile. The defeated furbolg, though honorable, were still a powerful force in their western province of Connaught, nursing their pride and their wounds. And beyond the shores, in the cold, churning northern sea, lurked another, older, and far more malevolent presence. These were the Fomorians, the shadowy, monstrous sea titans, part human, part elemental, who had oppressed previous inhabitants of Ireland, and who viewed the island as their own ancestral dowry. They were watching, and a leaderless kingdom was a prize ripe for the taking. The TDD needed a king, and they needed one immediately. The law was clear. He must be perfect in body, but the choice of who that perfect body should be was now the most critical decision they would ever make, and it would have to be made in the shadow of their greatest victory and their first profound failure. The search for a new ruler began, not with hope, but with a pressing, anxious urgency. The abdication of Nuada left a silence at the center of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a vacuum of power that the victory at Tuired could not fill. The law of physical perfection, the sacred principle they had brought with them from Phalius, had proven to be a double-edged sword, one that had just disarmed their own king. Yet the TDD were, by their very nature, a people of solutions. Their entire identity was built on the concept of dawn, the divine skill that could reshape reality. They did not see the world as a set of immutable laws, but as a series of complex problems to be solved by the right application of craft. Where the law presented a barrier, their artistry would seek a way over or through it. The problem was not that Nuada was wounded. The problem was that he was incomplete. And so, in one of the most remarkable collaborations in their entire history, the two greatest masters of the physical form stepped forward from the assembly. The first was Dayan Seisht, the master Liag, the chief physician of the Tuatha Dé Danann. His knowledge was not just of herbs and poultices. He understood the body as a living machine, a network of sinews, blood, and intention. He was the god of medicine, a figure whose skill was so profound that he could, it was said, sing the flesh closed over a wound or restore the breath to a silent lung. The second was Credan, the caird or artisan, but his title was more specific. He was the Haida, the brazier, the master of fine metals, the one who worked in bronze, in gold, and most potently in silver. Credne was the god of the smith's art, but not the thunderous, percussive smith of the battlefield. He was the jeweler, the engineer, the master of intricate form. Together, these two represented the perfect fusion of medicine and engineering, of the organic and the synthetic. They did not despair over the king's empty shoulder. They saw only a space waiting for their masterpiece. They convened not in a healer's tent, nor in a smoky forge, but in a quiet, sunlit workshop where the most precise work could be done. Dayan Seisht first applied his healing art to the king's wound, not just to close it, but to prepare it, to cleanse the stump and align the bone and sinew to accept a new limb. He preserved the nerves and the structures of the shoulder, keeping the living system ready. While he worked, Credne began his own task. He did not forge a simple, inert replacement, a mere symbol of an arm. He set out to build a functional one. He called for his finest, purest silver, a metal associated with the moon, with purity, and with hidden light. He and his assistants began the painstaking process of smelting, hammering, and shaping. This was not the work of a blacksmith, but of a watchmaker. They fashioned a hand with 5 perfect, articulated fingers. They created a wrist that could pivot and turn. They engineered an elbow joint of such complexity that it moved with the same fluid grace as Nuada's own. Daon Secht was at Credna's side throughout, directing the placement of sinews, perhaps fine silver wires or cleverly linked plates, that would respond to the slightest twitch of Nuada's remaining shoulder muscles. The Caithmage Tuired text is clinically precise in its description. They fashioned an armcon, IMB Luth Chechalama Indi, with the movement of every hand in it. This was the birth of mythical bionics, a demonstration that the TDD's magic was in fact a form of technology so advanced it was indistinguishable from life. For weeks, the work continued, the sound of the small, precise hammer and the whispered consultations of the healer and the smith filling the workshop. The historical Celts, centuries later, would be known as the undisputed masters of metalwork in Iron Age Europe. Their intricate bronze shields and golden torques, like the archaeological marvel of the Battersea Shield, show a baffling command of form and artistry. This story of Credna and Daon Secht is the mythological origin point of that real-world genius, a culture imagining its ancestral skill as something truly divine, capable of replicating life itself. Finally, the day came. The arm was complete, a beautiful, terrible object, gleaming with a soft lunar light, its every joint and rivet a testament to perfect craft. Nuada was brought before them, and the final, most delicate phase began. Daon Secht fitted the silver socket to the king's shoulder. Using his deepest healing magic, his setu, he sang the flesh and the metal together, grafting the silver to the bone, weaving the king's own sinews into the mechanism. The sources say he put the arm upon him, and a collective breath was held. Then slowly, Nuada focused his will. The silver fingers twitched, then curled into a fist. He flexed the silver wrist. He bent the silver elbow. It was alive. It moved as he willed it. He was, in a way, whole again. From that moment, he was no longer Nuada, the maimed. He was Nuada Ergetlam, Nuada of the silver arm. A cheer went up, a wave of relief and awe at the genius of their craftsman. But as the celebration quieted, a new, colder realization dawned. The council of chieftains and sages convened once more, and Nuada Ergetlam stood before them, his new hand gleaming at his side. He was functional. He could hold a shield, perhaps even a sword. But was he perfect? The law had spoken of a blemish, and what was this? The most beautiful blemish in the world? It was a masterpiece, but it was not flesh. It was a marvel of silver, but it was not life. It was, in the end, an admission of the wound, a brilliant, shining scar. The most conservative and powerful voices in the council, perhaps the Druids, who were guardians of the oldest laws, argued that the principle stood. The land could not be bonded to a king of silver and flesh. The fils en ingene, the ruler's truth, required a body that was whole and natural. The silver arm, for all its genius, was a disqualification. With a heavy, tragic finality, the council upheld the law. The throne of the Ard Ri remained empty. The masterpiece of Daon Secht and Credna, while a triumph of art, was a political failure. The TDD were now more desperate than ever, and this desperation would force them to look for a candidate beyond their own perfect golden circle to a choice that would prove catastrophic. The crisis of the empty throne pressed upon the Tuatha Dé Danann with the weight of a granite sky, forcing their hand. The law of perfection which had been their guiding principle, now seemed a trap of their own making. Nuada's silver arm, gleaming and articulate, was a monument to their skill, but also a constant reminder of their king's disqualification. They needed a ruler, one whose body was as whole as the kingdom they intended to build, and they needed him before their victory at Mag Tuired soured into political chaos. And so, in their desperation, the council turned their gaze outward, not toward a champion from their own ranks, but toward a candidate who represented a complex and dangerous political calculation. They looked to a man who walked the line between their world and the world of their most ancient adversaries. His name was Bress, and his primary qualification was his devastating, unearthly beauty. He was, the texts insist, the most perfectly formed and handsome man in all of Ireland, the very mirror of an ideal king. But Bress was not, in his entirety, of the Tuatha Dé. He was the product of an alliance that was both political and romantic. His mother was Eriu, a princess of the Tuatha Dé Danann, one of the very goddesses for whom the land would eventually be named. But his father was Elatha, a king of the Fomorians. Elatha was not the grotesque, monstrous figure that characterized so much of the Fomorian race. He was an exception, a being of golden-haired, solar beauty who had come to Eriu from the sea on a day of silver sunlight, a poetic, almost dreamlike encounter. Bress was the child of these two worlds, the union of the land's new masters and the sea's ancient dark-skinned titans. The TDD Council, in what must have seemed a moment of geopolitical genius, saw in Bress the perfect solution. By crowning him, they would satisfy their own law. He was, after all, physically flawless. But more importantly, they would be creating a powerful blood alliance with the Fomorians, the formidable shadowy power that lurked in the northern seas and had haunted every previous settlement of the island. By placing a half-Fomorian king on the throne of Ireland, they would in a single stroke placate two enemies, the Fomorians abroad and the law of perfection at home. It was a pragmatic, almost modern political maneuver, and it was championed by the mothers and women of the Tuatha Dé, who saw a path to a lasting peace. The decision was made. Bress the Beautiful was summoned, and he accepted the crown that Nuada, his silver arm hanging uselessly at his side, could no longer wear. But the kingship of the Tuatha Dé Danann was not merely a political office. It was a sacred, spiritual contract, and its primary virtue was not beauty nor strategic acumen, but generosity. The king, as the land's representative, was expected to be a conduit for its abundance. His halls were to be open, his fires bright, his cauldron full for any and all who came. The king's generosity was the physical proof of his legitimacy, and it was here that Bress's reign collapsed. He had the form of a king, but his soul was barren. He was, in his heart, a Fomorian, and the Fomorian nature, as the TDD understood it, was one of extraction, of meanness, of taking without giving. Bress was a miser. Almost immediately, the lifeblood of the kingdom began to dry up. The new king levied crushing taxes, demanding an intolerable tribute of milk, grain, and cattle, not to redistribute but to hoard. The great chieftains of the Tuatha Dé were not honored, they were humiliated. The oppression was not one of violence, but of grinding petty indignity. The Dagda, the good god, the lord of the overflowing cauldron, was put to work as a common laborer, forced to dig ditches and build the fortifications of Bres's New Dun. His divine hands, which could call forth the seasons, were calloused and raw from the spade. Ogma, the great champion and master of eloquence, the strongest of all the TDD, was reduced to gathering firewood, forced to carry bundle after bundle to feed the cold, stingy fires in his king's hall. Goibniu the smith, whose forge should have been ringing with the creation of magical weapons, found his craft stifled, his coal allowance restricted. The entire vibrant society of artists and craftsmen was being starved, its creative dawn suppressed by a king who understood only the mathematics of personal profit. The texts state that under Bres's rule, their knives were not greased, a potent domestic image of a joyless, fatless world. There was no music in his halls, no poetry, no laughter, only the cold, silent accounting of a tyrant. The breaking point, fittingly, came not from a warrior, but from a poet, a wandering Phile named Cairbre, the son of the goddess Etain, arrived at Bres's court at Tara. As a master poet, Cairbre was entitled by ancient law to the highest forms of hospitality. Instead, Bres, in an act of profound disrespect, housed him in a small, dark, cold hovel with no fire, no attendants, and no ale. After a long wait, a servant finally brought him food, 3 small, dry cakes of bread served on the smallest, meanest plate. Cairbre, who embodied the TDD's reverence for truth and art, sat in the darkness, the insult burning in his stomach. He waited until morning, and as he departed the king's fortress, he stood before the gates and delivered the very first air, or satire, in the history of Ireland. It was a short, devastatingly precise verse. Without food quickly on a dish, without a cow's milk on which a calf grows, without a man's abode in the dark of night, let that be the condition of Bres. In the world of the TDD, a satire was not a simple insult. It was a magical weapon, the verbal equivalent of the sword of light. It was fis and in ingene, the truth of the ruler, in reverse. Because the satire was true, Bray was miserly, his halls were dark, his land was barren. It had a physical, magical effect. As the words of the poet echoed across Tara, Bres's beautiful face, the very source of his authority, twisted. Red, suppurating boils erupted across his skin. His perfection was shattered, exposed as a lie by the power of the poet's truth. He was now blemished, just as Tuatha had been. The law of perfection, which had raised him up, now struck him down. His own law, the one he had tried to use to his advantage, had turned on him. The TDD, their reverence for him broken, rose up as one. Bres the blemished, his tyranny exposed, was driven from the throne. Humiliated and enraged, he fled Ireland, but he did not go to a quiet exile. He fled to his Fomorian father, to the dark kingdoms beneath the sea, carrying with him a burning desire for revenge that would soon bring the greatest war the island had ever known. The expulsion of Bray the Blemished, while a necessary act of social and spiritual restoration, did not solve the crisis of the Tuatha Dé Danann. It merely exchanged one for another. The throne of Tara was empty once more, a vacuum that mirrored the wound in their former king, Tuatha, who still, by inviolable law, could not reclaim his title. The TDD had rejected the miserly, oppressive order of their half-Fomorian ruler, but his flight to the dark, watery kingdoms of his father Elatha was a declaration of war. A profound, anxious silence settled over the leadership of the TDD. They were now a nation without a king, facing the certainty of a massive Fomorian reprisal. They gathered in the great hall of Tara, the symbolic heart of the island, not for a joyous feast, but for a high council of war. Their gates barred, their sentries doubled, the air thick with the smell of coming storms. They were a society of masters, each a genius in their own dawn or skill, but they were a body without a head, an orchestra without a conductor, waiting for a sign that their claim to this land was not a tragic mistake. It was into this tense, guarded atmosphere that a new figure arrived, walking out of the twilight as the sun was setting, staining the sky the color of copper. He appeared at the main gate of the great circular earthwork, the Rath Nariog, the fortress of the kings, and he did not come with an army, but with a small elite company of companions. He was a youth, but he carried himself with an authority that belchesed artillery 1,000 years of lineage. He was impossibly luminously beautiful, a beauty that was not the cold, static perfection of Brez, but the dynamic, vital radiance of the sun. The gatekeeper, a man named Kamal Macregale, looked out from his post and was struck by the light that seemed to emanate from the young man's face, as if he carried the dawn with him into the dusk. The gatekeeper challenged him, his voice rough with duty. The fortress was sealed, the feast was private, and none could enter. The young man smiled, his voice clear and melodic, a sound that carried over the wind. He asked to be admitted. The gatekeeper, bound by the ancient laws of Tara, refused. "It is a law of this hall," the keeper explained, "that no one may enter unless they are a master of a specific art, a dan, which the court does not already possess. We lack for nothing here." The youth, as undeterred, began a litany that would echo through all of Irish myth. "I am a sire," he said, "a right, a master carpenter." The gatekeeper shook his head. "We do not need you. We have a master right already, the great Lugh." The young man nodded as if expecting this. "Then I am a gobe," he continued, "a smith." The keeper's voice was firm. "We have Goibniu, the master smith, and his skill is unrivaled." The challenger's voice never wavered. "Then I am a Trenfer," he said, "a champion, a mighty warrior." The keeper almost smiled. "We have Ogma, our champion, whose strength is the measure of all strength." The exchange continued, a great verbal duel at the gates of power. The stranger claimed he was a croupier, a harper. "We have a harper," the keeper replied, "a fili, a poet. We have poets of the highest rank, a lieg, a physician. We have Dion Sesh and his children, the greatest healers known. A druid, a sorcerer. Our druids are wise in all the hidden ways. A cornaire, a cupbearer. We have our cupbearers." With every claim, the youth met the same refusal. He was listing the entire catalog of skills that defined the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the fortress, by its nature, already held a master for each. The guards on the wall began to relax, believing this to be the game of a boastful, arrogant boy who had just met his match against the fortress of all talents. But the young man was not finished. He paused, the setting sun catching the gold threads in his tunic, and he looked at the gatekeeper with a bright, piercing intelligence. "Go then," he said, his voice now ringing with a new authority, "and ask this question of those within. Ask them if they have in all their company any single man who possesses all of these arts in himself. Ask if they have a man who is right and smith, champion and harper, poet and historian, physician and sorcerer, all in one. The gatekeeper, stunned by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the claim, by the profound shift in the logic of the challenge, could only stare. This was not a claim to a single Don. It was a claim to all of them. He sealed the gate and ran, his feet pounding on the ancient earth, into the great hall where Nuada of the Silver Arm sat presiding over the worried chieftains. Breathlessly, the gatekeeper relayed the message, the impossible question from the youth at the gate. A deep silence fell over the hall. The TDD, the Masters of Specialization, looked at one another, their faces awash in the firelight. They had a master of everything, but they had no master of everything. The implications were staggering. This was not a new craftsman seeking employment. This was a new kind of being, a one-man pantheon. Nuada Ergetlam, his silver arm a cold, gleaming reminder of the law's inflexibility, was the first to understand. He saw in this challenge not arrogance, but a solution, a divine providence. "Let him enter," Nuada commanded, his voice cutting through the silence. For a man such as this, who is Samuldanuk, the master of all arts together, has never before come into this fortress. He is the one we have been waiting for. Seixkut. The great wooden bar was drawn back, the gates of Terra were thrown open, and Lugh Lamfada, Lugh of the Long Arm, walked into the hall, bringing with him a light that would scatter the shadows, and a mind that would for the first time unite the TDD's disparate geniuses into a force capable of facing the darkness that was gathering in the sea. As Lugh Lamfada stepped past the threshold of Tara, the great hall, which had been humming with the anxious energy of an impending war, fell into a profound, shimmering silence. The chieftains and sages, the masters of all the separate arts, lowered their cups and turned to stare at this shining youth, this Samuldanuk, who had claimed mastery of all their skills combined. Nuada of the Silver Arm, his own physical imperfection a cold weight at his side, recognized the arrival of a new, unsettling, and perhaps perfect principle of power. The very air around Lugh seemed to vibrate with a light the texts call Ta'indri, a kingly glow, and the assembly, though they did not yet know his name, instinctively understood that this was not a chance arrival. This was the sudden, sharp focus of a destiny that had been weaving itself in the shadows, far from their sight, for a generation. To understand the thunderstrike of his appearance, we must look back, past the gates of Tara, to a story of prophecy, paranoia, and the inevitable tidal power of fate. This Lugh, who stood before them as the embodiment of TDD artistry, was in fact the living, breathing result of their most terrifying enemy. His story begins not in the learned cities of the north, but on the salt-lashed, storm-racked cliffs of Tory Island, the great bleak fortress of the Fomorians. Here, in a tower of cold, unyielding stone, lived the Fomorian tyrant Baelor, a being of immense, monstrous power, whose most terrifying feature was a single eye, an orb so toxic that it was kept perpetually veiled, for its gaze meant instant, searing death to all it fell upon. Baelor was a king who ruled by terror, and he was a king who lived in terror, for a druidic prophecy had been whispered to him. He was fated to be killed, not by a rival king or a great champion, but by his own grandson. This was a classic Indo-European echo, a story shared with the Greek Danae, a universal myth of the patriarch consumed by his own lineage. Balor, in his paranoia, sought to wall off fate itself. He had one child, a daughter named Ethniu, a woman said to be as beautiful as the sea foam, and he made her a prisoner of his fear. He locked her in the highest, most inaccessible tower on Tory Island, a prison of glass, as some later stories would Roman Fomorian size it, surrounded by 12 matrons whose sole duty was to ensure that Ethniu never learned of the existence of men, that her innocence would be the high stone wall that kept Balor's prophecy from coming true. He had, he believed, made his daughter's world a sterile closed loop, and in doing so, he had secured his own immortality. But fate, as history so often reminds us, rarely asks for permission. It merely finds a crack in the wall. On the mainland, among the Tuatha Dé Danann, lived a chieftain named Cian, a son of the great healer Dian Sesh. He was a man of the Tuatha Dé, but his fate was inextricably bound to the Fomorians, particularly to Balor, who had once stolen from him a magical, miraculous cow of abundance, the Glas Gaibnen. Seeking revenge, or perhaps simply drawn by the irresistible pull of prophecy, Cian learned of the imprisoned princess. With the aid of a powerful druid or sorceress, a woman of the mists named Birog, he found his way to the tower. The magical arts of Birog, it is said, disguised Cian as a noblewoman, allowing him to slip past the 12 guardians and into the cold, lonely room where Ethniu had spent her entire life. There, the two met, the son of the Tidadi's healing god and the daughter of the Fomorians' great destroyer. Their union was not a matter of politics, but of pure, fated magnetism, a spark in the dark. From this single stolen meeting, a child was conceived. When Balor learned of the betrayal, that his own daughter was with child, his rage was absolute. The prophecy he had spent a lifetime preventing was now a living thing, growing within the very walls he had built to stop it. When Ethniu gave birth, Balor's soldiers, on his unbending orders, seized the infant. Some sources say it was triplets, and took him to be drowned in a deep, swirling coastal whirlpool. Balor stood and watched as the child, wrapped in a sheet, was cast into the raging cold Atlantic. He had killed the prophecy. He had once again walled off his fate. But as the bundle fell, the sorceress Birog was there, a shadow in the storm. She caught the child, the one true child of the prophecy, Lugh's, from the very jaws of the sea. She returned the infant to his father, Cian, who now held the living, breathing proof of Balor's doom. But Lugh could not be raised in the open. He was a marked child, a secret that could ignite a war. And so, in the deepest and most sacred of Celtic traditions, he was given into fosterage, a process of education and protection. His foster mother was Teiltiu, the last queen of the Firbolg, who raised him as her own, teaching him the deep, earthy wisdom of the land he would one day rule. His foster father, however, was none other than Manannán mac Lir, the enigmatic god of the sea, the guardian of the otherworld, the master of all magic and illusion. It was in Manannán's misty, timeless domain, a Mine Ablach, the Isle of Apple Trees, that Lugh learned his trade. He did not learn a craft. He learned craft itself. He learned the magic of the waves, the secrets of the smith's fire, the strategy of the vigil board, and the art of the sword from Manannán himself. He was raised by the sea, hidden from his grandfather, and educated by a god. This is why, when he finally arrived at Tara, he could claim mastery of all arts. He was not just a warrior or a poet. He was the product of a divine multicultural education, the adopted son of the sea and the land. He was Lugh of the long arm, so called, the texts suggest, because his reach was so great, or perhaps because his lineage was so long, reaching from the highest halls of the Tuatha Dé to the darkest depths of the Fomorian sea. He was the one perfect bridge between the two peoples, and therefore the only one who could truly, finally defeat them. As he stood in the silent hall, he was the prophecy, walking and talking, come home at last. The arrival of Lugh in the great hall of Tara was like the striking of a new chord, one that resonated with such power and clarity that it realigned the entire anxious assembly. The chieftains, who moments before had been staring into their cups, contemplating a leaderless, desperate war, now turned their gaze upon this radiant youth who claimed to be a master of all their arts. It was Nuada Ergetlam, his silver arm a cold, gleaming symbol of the rigid laws that had unthroned him, who understood the significance of this moment first. He saw in Lugh not a rival, but a solution, not an arrogant challenger, but the living embodiment of a new, more potent principle. The old way, the mastery of a single perfect dawn, had led them to this impasse. Lugh represented a future where all skills were unified, a single mind that could comprehend the entire tapestry. Nuada, still the sovereign in all but name, rose from his high seat and in a gesture of profound humility and strategic genius, abdicated his authority in favor of this newcomer. He ceded the Fath Chatawir, the sage's seat, to Lugh, a place of honor even higher than the king's. But before the Tuatha would follow this untested youth into the greatest war of their existence, his mastery had to be proven, not just claimed. Nuada, his eyes sharp, gestured to a fitchel board, the complex, checkered game of strategy that was a mirror of the Celtic mind. You claim all arts. Nuada's voice was quiet, but carried through the hall. Prove it. Lugh accepted the challenge, and the two sat, the silver-handed king of the old order and the golden-haired champion of the new. The hall watched, breathless, as the pieces, carved of yew and ivory, began to move. This was no mere game. It was a symbolic battle, a contest of two great intellects. Nuada played with the precision and wisdom of his long experience, but Lugh's, the Samoldanak, saw the board not as a series of moves, but as a single, flowing pattern. He saw every possibility, every consequence, every echo of fate, as if he were playing with the foreknowledge of a god. He did not just defeat Nuada. He played him to a perfect, inevitable conclusion, a strategic masterpiece that left the elder king stunned, not by his loss, but by the sheer, beautiful brilliance of Lugh's mind. With this single game, all doubt evaporated. Lugh was who he claimed to be. He was given full command of the Tuatha Dé Danann, charged with the defense of Ireland against the Fomorian invasion that his own grandfather, Balor, was surely planning. Lugh's first act was not to sharpen a sword, but to take inventory. He turned to the assembled masters, his voice ringing with the clarity of a newly forged blade. He was not a king like Bress, demanding tribute. He was a conductor, demanding to know the range of every instrument in his orchestra. He began with the foundation of their power, the divine artisans, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the three gods of art, who represented the Tuatha material soul. He summoned them, Goibniu the smith, Luchta the wright, and Credan the brazier. Goibniu, his face ruddy from the eternal heat of the forge, his great arms corded with a strength that could hammer worlds, stood first. "And what skill will you bring to this war?" Lugh asked. Goibniu's voice was a low rumble, like thunder in a distant valley. He made a promise, not of simple weapons, but of a magical industrial-scale victory. He swore that he would forge spears so potent that they would never miss their mark, and every wound they inflicted would be mortal. He would forge swords that would cut through any Fomorian armor as if it were sea mist. But more, he promised infinity. Though the battle should last for 7 years, he vowed, for every spear that is broken, a new one shall be in its place. For every sword that shatters, a new one will be at hand. The Fomorians will be defeated by an endless supply of perfect death. Next came Lugh the Right, the master of wood, his hands calloused from the plane and the adze, his eyes holding the quiet wisdom of the forest. "And you, Master Right?" Lugh asked. Lugh promised to provide the bodies for Goibniu's lethal souls. He would carve the shafts for every one of the smith's spearheads, each one perfectly balanced from the finest yew, so that they flew as if they had a will of their own. He would also craft the shields, light but impenetrable, that would protect the Tuatha Dé champions. Like Goibniu, he promised an endless supply, his art keeping pace with the smiths, ensuring no warrior would ever lack a defense. Finally, Credan the brazier stepped forward. He was the one who had fashioned Nuada's silver arm, the master of the fine and the intricate, the god of bronze, silver, and gold. His skill was not the brute force of the forge, but the precise art of the joiner. "And you, Credan?" Lugh's gaze softened, for this was the artist who had already tried and failed to solve the problem of the kingship. Credan's promise was the one that bound the others together. He would make all the rivets for Lugh's spears, the small, perfect clasps that would bind Goibniu's lethal heads to the wooden shafts, ensuring they would never fail, never separate. He would fashion the beautiful, functional hilts for the swords and the bright bronze bosses for the shields. His art was the art of unity, of making disparate parts into a single, functional, and beautiful whole. Lugh had just activated a divine assembly line, a magical factory for the war effort. The smith would forge the killing edge, the right would shape the body, and the brazier would bind them into one. This union of the three great craftsmen, all working in perfect synchronicity, was a metaphor for Lugh's entire strategy. He then turned to the rest of the hall. "Dian Secht," he called to the great physician, "what of your art?" Dian Secht, his eyes holding a shadow of jealousy for his son Miach's greater skill, nonetheless made a staggering vow. He would create a well of Slain, a spring of healing. Any Tuatha warrior, no matter how gravely wounded, even if their heads were severed, could be cast into its waters and would rise again, whole and ready to fight the following day. Lugh, in one evening, had secured for his army inevitable victory, endless supply, and practical immortality. Tara was no longer a fortress waiting for a siege. It was the heart of a new, unified, and truly divine war machine, and Lugh was its Samuldanach, its perfect, all-seeing engineer. With the forges of Tara now roaring, with the promise of endless, perfect weapons, and a well of healing secured to make his army immortal, Lugh's new order had taken hold, transforming the Tuatha Dé Danann from a collection of anxious masters into a unified, divine war machine. Yet a war is not won by weapons alone, but by knowledge, and one crucial element was still missing: intelligence. They needed to know the Fomorians' strength, their plans, and their position. As the great assembly continued, a figure rose who was in many ways the very antithesis of the shining, youthful, and precise Lugh. This was the Dagda, the Allathair, the All-Father of the Tuatha Dé. He was not a specialist, but a being of immense, almost chaotic power, a god of rude strength, insatiable appetite, and profound earthy magic, carrying a club so vast it took 8 men to lift, one end of which could kill 9 men, the other of which could restore them to life. He was also the guardian of the land's fertility, and he carried a cauldron from which no one ever went away hungry. He announced to the council that he would go himself under the protection of a declared truce to the Fomorian camp. His mission was twofold. He would act as a spy, observing their numbers, but he would also perform a vital magical act. He would use his power to bind the fertility of Ireland, the milk of its cows, the grain of its fields, so that the Fomorians could not draw sustenance from the land they sought to conquer. It was a mission of espionage and of divine agricultural protection. The TDD, trusting in the ancient laws of a truce, agreed, and the Dagda, his great club upon his shoulder, set off alone toward the Fomorian encampment, which now festered on the northern coast like a great dark stain. The Fomorians, led by the cold and calculating Indech, son of the sea goddess Domnu, received him not with the honor due to an ambassador, but with a deep, cold, and calculated mockery. They knew of the Dagda's reputation, his title as the good god, and his legendary appetite, which was a symbol of his divine connection to the land's plenty. They decided to put this very reputation to a test, to turn his greatest strength into a tool of his own humiliation. They announced they would prepare a feast for him, as was his due as an envoy. But this was a Fomorian feast, an act of grotesque, overwhelming, and malicious hospitality. They did not bring him a plate, or even a cauldron. They commanded that a great crater or pit be dug in the earth, a hole as deep as a man is tall. Into this hole they emptied 80 vast cauldrons of milk, 80 cauldrons of meal, and 80 cauldrons of fat, blending them into a monstrous lake of porridge. But this was not all. To this already colossal mixture, they added the butchered and boiled carcasses of goats, sheep, and swine, whole and unportioned, until the pit was a brimming, steaming pale morass, a mockery of the Dagda's own cauldron of plenty. The Fomorian champions, including Indech and Bress, the humiliated former king, gathered around the pit, their laughter low and guttural. They presented the Dagda with a spoon that was in truth a massive wooden ladle, big enough for a man and a woman to lie in, and then they gave him the terms. "You shall consume it all," they commanded, their voices dripping with contempt. "For if you leave any, you shall be put to death, as you have wasted the food of our hospitality." This was the trap. If he refused, he was dead. If he failed, he was dead, and his failure would be a symbolic, magical defeat for the TDD, proving their god of abundance was a fraud. The Dagda looked down into the steaming pit, his face unreadable. He was, the texts say, much troubled, but he was not afraid. He took the massive ladle, dipped it into the thick, lumpy porridge, and took his first spoonful, which he ate. What followed was not a meal, but a divine contest, a ritual of consumption. The Dagda, the great earthy god began to eat. He was not just satisfying hunger, he was performing his function. He was the land, and this was the challenge. He ate and he ate. He shoveled the scalding porridge into his mouth, his great belly, which usually hung before him, beginning to swell. He consumed the boiled carcasses, bones and all. The Fomorians, who had begun the spectacle with loud jests and laughter, slowly fell silent, their mockery turning to a stunned, uneasy disbelief. The level of the porridge in the pit began to drop. The Dagda ate his way through the milk, the meal, the swine, his breath coming in great rhythmic gusts, his brow slick with sweat, but his arm never slowing. He was consuming their malice, their insult, their entire calculated humiliation, and turning it into simple, mundane sustenance. Finally, after what seemed like hours, his great ladle scraped against the bottom of the pit. He had not just finished it, he had emptied it. He ran his fingers along the bottom, picking up the last remnants of meal and gravel, and ate those too. He had fulfilled the contract to the letter. He stood, his belly now so profoundly, comically vast, that it swelled like a sail on a ship, a testament to his divine capacity. The Fomorians were speechless. Their trap had failed. Their mockery had been inverted. They had tried to drown him in their plenty, and he had proven that his capacity, his divinity, was greater than anything their malice could produce. This strange, almost folkloric episode, preserved in the medieval manuscripts, has long been a puzzle for scholars. But seen through the lens of mythology, it is not comedy. It is a profound, seasonal myth. The Dagda, as the god of fertility, endures a ritual humiliation, the barrenness of winter, or the blight of the Fomorian offering, and by consuming it, neutralizes it. He processes the chaos and the waste, and by his own divine nature, transforms it into simple life. He leaves the Fomorian camp, walking slowly and painfully due to his swollen stomach, but he is the victor. He has not only spied on their camp, he has ritually defeated their kings and proven that his power, the power of the land of Ireland, is indomitable. And as he journeyed back toward his own lines, he moved toward an encounter that would pivot the war from ritual to reality. The Dagda turned his back on the Fomorian encampment, his mission complete. The echo of their stunned silence, a far more satisfying victory than any roar of acclamation. He moved with a slow, ponderous gait, his vast belly swollen like a sail on a ship from the grotesque porridge, a testament to his divine capacity to absorb and neutralize all the malice his enemies could muster. He was now a walking, breathing symbol of the TDD's indomitable life force. As he journeyed back toward the safety of the TDD's lines, he was not just a spy returning with intelligence on Fomorian numbers. He was a ritual victor, having just performed and won a contest of divine abundance. His path took him through the heart of the island, following the winding silver path of a river known as the Unius, a waterway that cut through the ancient forests of Connaught. The air was still, thick with the damp, peaty smell of the land, a land that now waited, holding its breath, for the clash of the two great armies. This river, like all rivers in the Celtic mind, was a liminal space, a boundary between the known and the unknown, a place where the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest. It was here, at the river's edge, that he saw her. He had not sought her out, but in this time of cosmic realignment, their meeting was inevitable. She was a woman, Yet the term felt insufficient, a vessel too small to contain the power that radiated from her. She was straddling the river, one foot planted firmly on the south bank, the other on the north, a living, breathing bridge over the flowing water, a posture of absolute dominion. This was the Morrigan, the great queen or phantom queen, a being who was not a single entity but a trinity, a goddess of prophecy, of sovereignty, and of the raw psychological terror of war. She was the one who flew as a scald crow over the battlefield, her shriek turning the blood of heroes to ice. She was the Anu, the mother of the gods, and she was the Bab, the raven of doom, the washer at the ford, who was seen on the eve of a battle, washing the bloody armor of the men who were fated to die. And this is what she was doing. The river Unius ran red around her ankles as she bent over the water, her hands scrubbing at a pile of shields and mailcoats, the spectral, preemptive spoils of the war that had not yet begun. She was not preparing for the battle. She was counting its dead. The Dagda, his divine nature recognizing her own, stopped. He, the god of life and earthly abundance, stood before the goddess of fated death and chaotic sovereignty. He, still grotesque from his encounter, his body a parody of fertility, addressed her. Their conversation is lost to the mists of the text, but their actions are recorded with a stark, ritualistic clarity. This was not a meeting of mortals, full of fear or seduction. It was an alignment of primal forces. They had, the texts say, a union, a compert. There, at the river's edge, the god of the land's plenty and the goddess of its fated violence came together. It was a sacred, terrifying coitus, a binding of opposites. In this act, the Dagda, as the All-Father, was not just sating a desire. He was securing an alliance. He was binding the land's chaotic, dark, and prophetic soul to the new, ordered, and artistic destiny of the Tuatha Dé Danann. When the act was complete, the Morrigan rose, her face as impassive and as beautiful as a storm cloud. In payment for their union, and as a sign of her new allegiance, she gave him her dawn, her divine skill. She offered him a prophecy. She turned her gaze from the Dagda to the future, to the battlefield of Mag Tuired, and she began to speak. Her voice was not the clear, melodic tone of the TDD's bards, but a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the stones and the water itself. She gave the Dagda a battle plan, but it was one of magic, not of steel. She promised him that she, in her own form, would go to the Fomorian army. She would stand before their champion, Indek, son of the sea goddess Domnu, and she would take from him the blood of his heart and the kidneys of his valor. This was not a physical threat. It was a promise of profound magical and psychological warfare. She would use her Gyasa and her Fesk, charms and seeing, to sap the Fomorian king's courage, to fill his mind with dread, to make his hands tremble on the hilt of his sword before the first blow was ever struck. She promised to be a serpent, sharp and hard, undermining their foundations. She also gave the Dagda a second, darker prophecy, a long, cryptic, and terrible poem describing the victory to come, a vision of spears in showers, a battle cry on high, and the end of the Fomorian sea power. It was a guarantee of victory, but one that was soaked in the blood she was already washing from the spectral armor. She was aligning herself with Lugh, with the new ascendant order, and she was promising to bring the full weight of her terrifying aspect to bear on their enemies. The Dagda listened, the words of the Phantom Queen sinking into him, a cold and final guarantee. His mission was now more complete than he could have imagined. He had left the Tuatha Dé camp as a spy, endured humiliation as a ritual, and now he was returning as the bearer of a divine covenant. He left the Morrigan at her work, the water still running red, and made his way back to Tara. He reported to Lugh and the assembled chieftains, his voice heavy. He told them of the Fomorian numbers, of their mockery, and of his triumph over their poisoned porridge. And then, in a hushed voice, he told them of the meeting at the river, of the union with the great queen, and of the dark, bloody prophecy that was now their greatest and most terrible assurance of victory. The time for preparation was over. The time for the battle itself was at hand. The Dagda's return from the Fomorian camp, his great belly a monument to his ritual victory, and his mind now holding the cold, dark prophecy of the Morrigan, marked the end of all preparation. The time for strategy, for forging, and for counsel was over. The time for the fulfillment of that prophecy was at hand. Lugh Lamfada, his authority absolute, his mind the one great unifying consciousness of the Tuatha Dé Danann, gave the final command. From the high earthwork ramparts of Tara, the signal was given, and the shining host of the divine race, the people of Dan, began to march. It was a movement unlike any army the land had yet seen, not a horde driven by plunder, but a river of light, a nation of masters arrayed for a single existential purpose. Their new, endlessly supplied weapons from the forge of Goibniu gleamed with a light that was not just reflected sun, and the air around them hummed with the power of the treated Dana and the magic of the healing well that awaited them. They marched to the designated battlefield, a place already etched into their short history, Mag Tuired, the Plain of Towers, near the Loch Arbok, a site close to the modern Cong in County Mayo. This was the same great, open expanse where they had already defeated the Firbolg, a fact that was not lost on their druids. The land had chosen this place, this great, flat stage of destiny, for the final adjudication of its masters. And as the Tuatha arrived, a luminous line spreading across the plain, they saw, or rather felt, the arrival of their enemy. If the Tuatha were a river of light, the Fomorians were the tide of the cold northern ocean. They came from the sea, their transports landing on the coast and disgorging a force that seemed less like an army and more like a migration of nightmares. This was the full, monstrous power of the Fomorian race, a force that chaos itself had spawned. The medieval scribes recording this struggled for words, describing a host that was dark, heavy, and vast, a people of the sea who brought with them the gloom of the sunless depths. Here was the full, terrifying expression of their lineage, not the beautiful, anomalous exceptions like Elatha or Bress, but the core of their power. Champions with the heads of goats and bulls, warriors with a single massive arm growing from their chest, or a single hopping leg beneath their torso, and at their head rode the greatest of their lords, Indek, son of the sea goddess Domnu, his face grim, already feeling the metaphysical chill of the Morrigan's curse. Bress, the deposed king, his once beautiful face now a mask of vengeful spite, and, held in the center of their host, a figure so terrible that he was a weapon in himself, a living siege engine. This was Balor, Lugh's own grandfather, a giant of a man, his one great toxic eye lidded and veiled, a single vast eyelid, heavy as a waterlogged sail, held closed by 4 attendants, for its power was too great to be unleashed by accident. The 2 armies, the embodiment of divine order and the embodiment of primordial chaos, faced each other across the plain. The second battle of Mag Tuired, the Tuatha Dé Danann, Mage Tuired, had begun. The battle itself was not a single, swift clash, but a long, grinding, and terrible war. The Cathmange Tuired text, our only detailed record, describes a battle that was both heroic and deeply strange. On the first day, the champions dueled between the lines, a formal display of prowess that tested the measure of each side. But the true, unique nature of the TDD's strategy quickly became apparent. In a marvel of divine logistics, the Tuatha Dé Danann, Goibniu the smith, Lugh the wright, and Creighton the brazier did not remain in Tara, but established their magical forge on the very edge of the battlefield. As Tuatha warriors broke their spears or blunted their swords on Fomorian hides, they would retreat to the forge where Goibniu, with 3 mighty magical strokes, would hammer out a new perfect spearhead. Lugh, in 3 strokes, would carve and fettle a new shaft, and Creighton, in 3 strokes, would set the rivets, making a new perfect weapon in mere moments. The Fomorians, fighting with brute strength, were baffled by an enemy whose supply of arms was quite literally infinite. But a more profound horror was dawning on them, centered on a spring at the edge of the TDD lines. Dian Secht, the great physician, along with his children Octriuil and Ermet, was presiding over his well of Slime, the healing spring into which he and his children were whispering the great Setu of healing. As the battle raged, the TDD dead and wounded were carried from the field, their bodies broken, their limbs severed, and they were cast unceremoniously into the enchanted waters. The Fomorians watched in growing dread as the slain warriors, whom they had just cut down with monstrous effort, rose from the water, whole and unblemished, their wounds gone, their vigor returned, and silently, grimly, picked up a new spear from Goibniu's forge to rejoin the fight. The Fomorians were trapped. They were fighting an army that could not be disarmed and could not be killed. Their greatest champions were being worn down by an immortal, endlessly armed foe. This supernatural combination, the well of Slime and the magical forge, was the ultimate expression of the Tuatha's dawn. They were not just winning the battle, their system was defeating the Fomorians' lack of one. The Fomorian leaders, seeing their losses mount, their warriors exhausted and demoralized by the unkillable enemy, knew that attrition was impossible. Their only hope was to shatter the TDD's systems. They sent a champion to spy on the well, and he, though he paid for it with his life, returned with the secret. The Fomorians, in a desperate, unified charge, fought their way to the well, and using the ancient standing stones of the plain, the towers of its name, they filled the well, destroying it, choking the spring of healing with the very stones of the land. The TDD's immortality was broken. The battle was now, for the first time, a fair fight, and with the playing field leveled, the Fomorians knew it was time to unleash their own final, terrible advantage. The destruction of the Well of Slime was not just a tactical loss, it was a profound spiritual shock to the Tuatha Dé Danann. The spring, which had been a symbol of their divine resilience, was now a choked-as muddy pit filled with the broken standing stones of the plain, and with its silencing, a cold, unfamiliar sensation entered the TDD ranks. Mortality. For the first time, a wound was a permanent, grievous fact. A death was a final, irreversible absence. The Fomorian host sensed this shift in the very air of the battlefield. The dread that had been growing in them as they fought an unkillable army evaporated, replaced by a surge of brutal, victorious confidence. Their own champions were falling, but so now were their enemies. The scales had been balanced, and with the TDD's greatest magic broken, the Fomorian leaders knew it was time to deploy their own. From the dark, monstrous heart of the Fomorian host, a new, terrible sound began, a rhythmic, guttural chanting. The Fomorian warriors, who had been surging forward, parted like a dark sea, clearing a wide avenue toward the TDD lines. And down this avenue, moving with the slow, inexorable menace of a glacier, came the true champion of the Fomorian race, the living, breathing prophecy that Lugh himself embodied. This was Balor, the king of the Fomorians, Lugh's grandfather, the one who had tried to drown his own lineage in the cold, churning Atlantic. He was a being of continental size, a giant whose head towered over the other champions like a mountain peak. But his size was not his weapon. His true, terrible power was hidden, kept under a heavy, ritualized guard. He was Balor na Suila Nimhe, Balor of the toxic eye, and his gaze was the antithesis of all life. He was led by his attendants to a low hillock in the center of the plain, a place from which he could survey the entire reeling TDD army. His one great eye, the source of his power, was closed, the lid a vast, wrinkled, and heavy fold of flesh, like a leathern curtain hanging over it. Such was the potency of its venom, the texts tell us, that he could not keep it open by his own will. It was kept perpetually shut, not just to protect his allies, but because its power was so great it would poison the very land he walked on if left uncovered. This evil eye is one of humanity's most ancient and widespread fears, a concept found in cultures from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley, a belief that envy, malice, or a supernatural power could be projected through a glance, causing withering, sickness, or death. In the mythology of the Fomorians, this was not a superstitious folk belief. It was a state-level, strategic, and entirely literal weapon of mass destruction. The story of the eye's creation speaks to its accidental, toxic nature. As a youth, Balor had spied on his father's druids as they were brewing a great fisk of death, a potion of annihilation. As he looked in through the open window, the fumes, the pure, distilled essence of the spell, had risen up and been absorbed directly into his open, curious eye, transforming it forever into a conduit for that same lethal magic. Now, on the plain of Tuired, the Fomorian druids began the high, wailing chant to undo the bindings that held this power in check. 4 of his strongest attendants, their faces rigid with a mixture of terror and concentration, stepped forward. They did not touch the lid with their hands. They carried a great polished slat, a lever or rod of bronze, which they inserted under the heavy fold of flesh. With a great unified heave, their muscles straining, they began to lift the vast heavy lid. It opened slowly, a sliver of darkness revealed first, then a wider crescent as the great eyelid was peeled back. There, beneath, the eye of Balor was revealed. It was not a shining, radiant orb like Lugh's Tuired. It was a thing of pure, condensed night, a baleful eye that seemed to drink the light from the air, a roiling, venomous, and unblinking sphere. It fixed its gaze upon the front line of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and as the gaze fell, the world dissolved. There was no beam of light, no bolt of fire. There was only effect. A line of TDD champions, including Nuada himself, who was fighting in the vanguard, were caught in that first terrible glance. The texts say the gaze blasted them. Their shining scythes, the shields from Luchta's hand, blackened and cracked as if plunged into acid. Their armor, bright from Credna's art, withered. The warriors themselves, they simply ceased. They were turned in an instant to a pile of scorched ash, their life force extinguished, their bodies unmade by the pure toxic will of the Fomorian anti-god. A scream of pure animal terror went up from the Tuired ranks. This was a magic they could not counter. Goibniu's spears were useless, Dian Sesht's healing was gone, and Ogma's strength was irrelevant. The TDD line, which had held like a wall of shining steel, shattered. Warriors threw down their weapons and ran, their divine courage completely broken by a force that did not fight, but simply undid creation. Balor, his eye now fully open, took a slow step forward, and the Fomorian army, roaring in a single deafening wave of triumph, surged forward behind him, advancing under the protection of that all-destroying gaze. The battle was over. The Tuatha Dé Danann were in a full panicked rout. All hope was gone. All dawn was useless, and in the center of the chaos, only one figure remained, unmoving. Lugh Lamfada, the Samaldanic, stood alone, his face pale but set, as he watched his grandfather, the walking end of the world, turn his great toxic eye, that fated instrument of doom, slowly toward him. The rout was absolute. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the divine people of art, a host that had been proven immortal by the well of Slime, were now just terrified mortal men, their courage shattered, their backs turned, fleeing in a wave of panic from the all-consuming, unmaking gaze of Balor's eye. Their greatest champions, perhaps even Nuada of the Silver Arm himself, were now just handfuls of cooling ash, a testament to the Fomorians' ultimate, unanswerable weapon. The Fomorian host roared in a single, deafening, triumphant wave, surging forward under the protection of that terrible, annihilating gaze. The battle was over, the plain was lost. But in the center of this swirling chaos, as the TDD lines dissolved behind him, one warrior stood his ground, Lugh Lamfada, the Samaldanic, the master of all arts, remained a single, shining, unmoving point of light in the face of the encroaching darkness. He faced his grandfather, the walking embodiment of the prophecy he had been born to fulfill. Balor, his great eye now fully open, a roiling, venomous portal of death, saw this lone figure. He saw the youth who defied him, and in that instant there must have been a cold, terrible recognition. This was the one, the child of Ethniu, the infant he had cast into the sea, the living, breathing, and final proof that fate could not be walled out, nor drowned. The giant's head, which moved with the slow, ponderous effort of a siege tower, began to turn, bringing the full, focused malice of his gaze to bear on this last, insolent point of resistance. His attendants, those who had raised the lid, grunted and heaved, helping their master aim the weapon that would end the line of TDD kings forever. Lugh, standing in the shadow of this approaching doom, did not raise a shining, enchanted sword. He did not call upon a forgotten spell. He reached instead for the most simple, most primal of weapons. In his hand, he held a sling, the Cran Tabhile, a weapon of the shepherd and the boy, a thing of leather and sinew. But the projectile he placed within it was no simple river stone. It was a tathlum, a sling stone that had been meticulously prepared, perhaps a mass of hardened clay mixed with the blood of vipers, or a perfect sphere of iron, a brain ball which Celtic heroes were known to make from the brains of their enemies, mixed with lime and hardened like rock. Whatever its composition, it was a projectile of pure, concentrated dawn, the focal point of all Lugh's skill, all his rage, and all his destiny. As the great toxic eye of Balor, a vast, dark, unblinking orb, began to swivel and fix upon him, Lugh did not wait for the gaze to land. He did not give the power time to unmake him. He began to swing the sling, a slow, gathering circle at first, then faster and faster, a humming, whistling blur, a perfect, controlled orbit of lethal potential. The Fomorian attendants gave a final heave. The eye was on him. The world held its breath. In that sliver of an instant, before the gaze could dissolve him, Lugh released the stone. It flew. It was not a lobbing, arcing shot. It was a straight, serpent-like, and wind-swift line, a projectile of such preternatural speed and accuracy that it was to the Fomorian giant undefendable. The tathlum crossed the gap between them, a single, deadly point of light, and struck the target. It did not hit the heavy lid, nor the armored brow, nor the leathern cheek. It struck the eye. The tathlum, propelled by the Samaldonic and guided by a prophecy that had been waiting a generation to be fulfilled, hit the vast, venomous, roiling orb with a force that was not just physical, but metaphysical. The impact was catastrophic. The stone did not bounce off. It did not merely blind. With the full, focused, irresistible power of Lugh's destiny, the sling stone punched through the eye, driving the toxic, jellied mass and its dark magic with it. The Cath Mage Tuired text states, with a kind of awestruck clinical horror, that the stone drove the eye of Balor out through the back of his head, a perfect, fatal inversion. The weapon of mass destruction, the unmaking gaze, was turned in its final, agonizing moment backward. Balor's dying act was a scream that was half gurgle, as the eye, dislodged and mortal, cast its last, venomous look, not upon Lugh, but upon the 27 ranks of the Fomorian army that stood marshaled behind him. The effect was immediate. The Fomorian champions, who a moment before had been roaring in triumph, were caught in the final, dying blast of their own leader's power. They were scythed down, blasted into the same black ash to which they had reduced the TDD. Balor himself, his brain case shattered, his greatest weapon having just annihilated his own host, stood for one silent, impossible moment. Then, like a mountain giving up its hold on the sky, he crashed to the ground, his fall so vast that the very plain of Mag Tuired shook, and his body, the texts say, formed a new, great, circular valley where it lay. The silence that followed was more profound than any battle cry, the Triquest. The rooted Tuatha Dé stopped running. They turned, their faces a mixture of terror and dazed disbelief. They saw their enemy's king, the indestructible giant, lying dead. They saw their own champion, Lugh, standing alone, his sling still in his hand. The fear in that instant, like a reversed tide, left them and crashed into the Fomorian ranks. The battle was not just turned, it had been reborn, and it was now, finally, a slaughter. The fall of Baelor was not a sound, it was an event, a sudden earth-shaking stop that ended the battle's terrible momentum. The Tuatha Dé Danann, who had been in a full, panicked flight, skidded to a halt in the mud and blood of the plain, their heads turned back in a dazed, collective disbelief. They saw the impossible. Their enemy's greatest weapon, the unmaking eye, was a blackened, shattered ruin. Their greatest champion, the mountain-sized giant, was now just a newly formed, lifeless hill, his body a monument to his own inverted power. And standing before this new valley, a single shining figure against the smoke, was Lugh Lamfada, his sling hanging limply from his hand, his prophecy and his grandfather both fulfilled. In that moment, the profound animal terror that had broken their ranks did not just evaporate, it was transferred. It left the hearts of the TDD and flooded, in a single, cold, paralyzing wave, into the Fomorians. They had witnessed their invincible king destroy their own rearguard in his death throes. They were now leaderless, their divine right to terror broken. Lugh raised his arm, no longer the long arm of the Samoldanak, but the arm of a king, and he let out a cry that was not of survival, but of pure, ascendant victory. And the TDD, in a single, unified, and terrible roar, answered him. They turned. The rout, in an instant, reversed itself. The prey became the hunters, and the hunters, their courage shattered, their magic spent, became the prey. The Fomorian army, which had been a disciplined dark tide, disintegrated into a million terrified individual parts. The TDD, their dawn and their divine fury restored, fell upon them, and the second final phase of the battle began, not a contest, but a slaughter. The magic of the forge and the well were gone, but the TDD were still gods, and their skill with the weapons they held was a thing of supernatural beauty. Ogma, the champion, his strength no longer needed against an unkillable foe, now waded through the Fomorian ranks, his great sword a blur, carving a path of vengeance for his fallen kin. The Dagda, his great club, the Lorg Mor in his hands, brought to bear the full, earthy power of his nature, one end killing, the other, for today, left unused, and over it all, a new sound, the one the Morrigan had promised, the high, shrieking caw of the Badib, the battle crow, as the goddess herself flew in a black, circling vortex over the field, her cry a form of psychological warfare that amplified the Fomorians' terror, making them see phantoms in the mist, turning brother against brother in their panicked flight. In the center of the chaos, Lugh sought out the one figure who represented the war's true, bitter cause, not the monstrous Indesh who had been slain by Ogma, but Bress. He found the deposed king not fighting, but captured his beautiful face, still faintly marked by the poet's satire, now pale with the mundane human fear of death. Bress was brought before Lugh, the man who had sat in his throne, and he was thrown to his knees. Lugh, his face still streaked with the grime of the fight, looked down on the half-Fomorian, half-TDD, whose miserly heart had brought this entire apocalypse down upon them. Bress, who had lost all sovereignty, now had only one art left, the art of the plea. "Spare my life," he begged, his voice stripped of all its kingly resonance. "I am of your mother's people. Spare me, and I will bring all the Fomorians to this place next year to fight for you." Lugh's expression was cold. A year's delay is not a victory. Bress, desperate, tried again. He would use his Fomorian lineage to guarantee a different kind of tribute. "Spare me," he pleaded, "and I will ensure that the cows of Ireland are always in milk." This was a potent offer, a promise of eternal, unnatural abundance. The Tuatha Dé Druids, stepping forward, considered this. They conferred, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. "No," they finally pronounced. "He cannot be our king, and he has no power over the cow's natural cycles." Bress, his last best offer refused, had only one thing left to trade: the truth. "Then spare my life," he said, his voice now quiet, "and I will give you the dawn of the land itself. You are masters of the forge, the song, and the sword, but you do not know the soil. I will teach you the secrets of the Firbolg and the Fomorians. I will teach you when." El following, Lugh paused, his sword tip at Bress's throat. When to plow," Bress said, his eyes fixed on the earth. "When to sow, and when to reap." It was this, the most fundamental, simple, and vital piece of knowledge that saved his life. Lugh, in a moment of profound, kingly wisdom, saw the value. The TDD were a divine race, but this knowledge would root them. It would transform them from magical invaders into a true agricultural people bound to the seasons of their new home. He accepted the bargain. Bress's life was spared. He was not a king, not a warrior, but he would be their first and most important teacher of the harvest. But for the rest of the Fomorian army, there was no such mercy. The battle, now over on the plain, became a long, island-wide pursuit. The Tuired, relentless, hounded the survivors from the Plain of Towers, chasing them west and north, back toward the wild, rocky coasts from which they had come. They drove them through the bogs and over the mountains, a wave of light pushing back a wave of darkness. The Fomorians were driven, at last, to the cliff edges and the strands, to the very edge of the land they had sought to claim. There, with the cold, indifferent Atlantic at their backs, they were given a final, brutal choice: the spear or the sea. Most chose the sea, casting themselves into the waves, their dark forms swallowed by the element that had birthed them. Their power over the land of Ireland, their ability to demand tribute, their very presence was broken, washed away. The TDD stood, exhausted, on the high cliffs, watching the last of their ancient enemies disappear into the foam. The island was quiet, the air was clean, and Ireland at last, truly and completely, belonged to the Tuatha Dé Danann. In the vast, bloody stillness that followed the rout, the plain of Mag Tuired was a landscape transformed, a field of ruin dominated by the new, great hill that was the body of Balor. The Fomorian threat, which had haunted Ireland for generations, like a cold, tidal dread, was broken, its remnants scattered into the very ocean that had spawned them. The Tuatha Dé Danann stood masters of the island, their victory absolute, but it was a victory measured in silence and exhaustion. The Well of Slane was a choked pit of stone, and the cost in divine blood had been high. As Lugh, the Samaldanic, looked out over the field, he was no longer just a champion. He was the undisputed sovereign, his reign forged in the single perfect flight of a slingstone. But as the TDD began the grim work of gathering their dead and tending to their new permanent wounds, a new, lesser, but deeply personal violation was discovered. In the final chaotic moments of the battle, as the Fomorian rearguard fled, a small, opportunistic band, perhaps led by the humiliated Bray himself, had not fled directly to the sea. They had skirted the battle, and in a final act of spite, had broken into the TDD's own camp. They had not been able to steal the great treasures, the stone, the sword, or the spear, but they had taken something just as potent, a thing that was the personal, spiritual core of the TDD's good god. They had stolen the Dagda's harp. This was not a mere trinket. It was Uaithne, also known as Dowerblay, the oak of two blossoms. It was a great, heavy harp, carved from a single piece of magical wood, strung with the sinews of a sea creature, and it was the living soul of the Dagda's art. It was not just a source of music. It was the source of all organized sound, the very regulator of the TDD's emotional world. The Dagda, his great club in hand, his face a mask of thunder, would not let this stand. The war was not truly over until the music had been reclaimed. He, Lugh, and the mighty champion Ogma, the triumvirate of TDD power, representing primal magic, high kingship, and pure strength, set off immediately. They followed the tracks of the Fomorian thieves, a trail that led them away from the coast, inland, to a great, fortified feasting hall where the surviving Fomorian leaders, including Braze and his father Elatha, had taken refuge. Believing themselves safe, they had barred the doors, lit the fires, and had gathered to nurse their wounds and their pride. And in a final gesture of arrogant triumph, they had taken the Dagda's harp and hung it high on the wall of their hall, a trophy of their theft, a mute symbol of their defiance. The three TDD gods arrived at the hall. They did not pause. They did not lay siege. The doors were barred, but Ogma, the god of strength, put his shoulder to the great oak beams, and with a sound like a thunderclap, splintered the bar and burst them open. The three champions stood in the doorway, framed against the twilight, a terrifying trinity of victors. The Fomorians within, dozens of their greatest, darkest-skinned champions, were startled, their hands leaping to the swords upon their knees. They saw the three intruders, and a low, mocking laugh rumbled through the hall. Three men, however divine, against so many. But the Dagda was not looking at the Fomorians. His gaze was fixed on his harp, hanging silent and captive on the far wall. The Fomorians rose, their swords now drawn, ready to cut down the interlopers. But the Dagda held up a hand, silencing his own companions. He did not draw his club. He simply filled his great chest and called to his possession. "Come to me, Dowerblay," he roared, his voice the sound of the earth's own gravity. "Come to me, Coimshed." And the harp, a living, conscious thing, heard its master. It did not wait to be taken down. In a single, violent, explosive movement, it tore itself from the wall peg and flew. It shot across the feasting hall like a golden spear, a blur of magical wood and shining string. It was an act of such sudden, lethal loyalty that, as the texts tell us, the harp itself slew 9 of the Fomorians who were unlucky enough to be in its path before it settled, with the gentleness of a returning hawk, into the vast, open, and waiting arms of the Dagda. The hall was in stunned silence. The Fomorians stared at the 9 dead, killed by a musical instrument, and the Dagda, his face transformed with a deep, loving smile, cradled his harp. He was now complete. The Fomorian champions, their shock turning to rage, surged forward. But the Dagda, with the harp now secure, simply placed his thick fingers upon the strings. He was ready to play. His harp, as Uaithne, was the master of the three anthems of music, the three strains that have the power to command the soul of any who hears them. First, he played the Geantra'i, the strain of joy. A wave of bright, laughing, irresistible music filled the smoky hall. The Fomorians, their swords raised, their faces twisted in hate, were stopped cold. A moment later, a strange, gurgling sound began. They were laughing. A warrior, his hand on his way to the Dagda's throat, suddenly stopped, threw back his head, and wept with pure, unadulterated hilarity. The entire hall of killers dissolved into a pandemonium of ecstatic joy, their weapons clattering to the floor as they danced, clapped each other on the back, and were rendered utterly, helplessly happy. Then, as the laughter reached a hysterical, breathless peak, the Dagda's fingers shifted. The music modulated, sinking into a key so profound, so aching, that the very air grew heavy. He played the Goltrai, the strain of sorrow. The laughter in the hall choked, cracked, and died, replaced by a single, unified gasp. And then came the weeping. The Fomorian giants, the lords of the cold sea, collapsed where they stood. They were overcome by a grief so vast, so total, that it hollowed them out, weeping for their lost homes, their dead king, their broken power, for every sorrow they had ever known. Finally, as the hall was filled with the sound of 100 broken hearts, the Dagda's touch softened one last time. The melody simplified, becoming a gentle, repeating, sinking phrase, a sound as soft as sea fog, as comforting as the womb. He played the Swandrai, the strain of sleep. The great, shoulder-racking sobs of the Fomorians softened, hitched, and faded. Their great, weary heads bowed. Their eyes, red with weeping, closed. One by one, they slumped over in their seats, their grief sliding into an irresistible, profound, and magical slumber. Within moments, the entire hall was silent, filled only with the deep, rhythmic breathing of a defeated, sleeping army. The Dagda, his harp now quiet, stood in the center of the room, a god of peace. He, Lugh, and Ogma, their mission complete, turned and walked untouched from the fortress, leaving their enemies to their dreams. The music, the soul of their people, was home, and the war in all its forms was finally, truly over. With the Fomorian threat dissolved into the northern sea, and the Dagda's harp safely restored to its place of honor, the Tuatha Dé Danann settled into the complex, quiet business of peace. The plain of Mag Tuired was left to the crows and the slow healing growth of grass, its new sunken valley a permanent reminder of Baelor's fall. Lugh now presided as the undisputed Ard Ri, the master of all arts, having proven himself the master of all foes, and he ruled from the high seat as at Tara. Yet in this new, golden age, one small dissonant note from their past remained. Nuada, the king who had brought them to this island, the one who had lost his arm and his crown in the very same battle, still walked among them. He was Nuada Ergetlam, Nuada of the silver arm, and the masterpiece of Credne and Dian Secht was a constant, gleaming, and cold reminder of the inflexible law that had unthroned him. The arm was a marvel of Dan, a testament to their craft, but it was not flesh. It was a beautiful, functional blemish, and as long as he wore it, Nuada was incomplete, a hero forever disqualified from his own destiny. But in the peace that followed the Great War, another quieter Dan began to flourish. one that had been overshadowed by the forge and the spear. Among the Tuatha Dé was Miach, son of the great physician Dian Secht. While his father was the master of the rules of medicine, the grand architect of healing, Miach was its poet. He possessed a deeper, more intuitive, and, as it would prove, more profound understanding of the living body. He did not see the wound as a problem to be solved with artifice, but as a break in a pattern that could be restored. He had watched his father's work on Nuada, had admired the silver arm, and had, in his heart, known it to be a failure, a substitution, when the true art would have been restoration. He had, the stories say, found and taken Nuada's original, severed arm from the battlefield of the first Mag Tuired, and in a secret place he had preserved it with salts and subtle charms, waiting for the day his skill was great enough. Now, in the quiet of the post-war kingdom, Miach came before Lugh and before Nuada, and he made a quiet, staggering claim. He could make the king whole again. He did not need silver, nor the craft of Credon. He had only his setu, his incantations, and the original severed limb. With the court's permission, the long, patient, and truly magical operation began. Miach brought forth the preserved arm. He laid it against the healed stump of Nuada's shoulder, and for 3 days and 3 nights, Miach and his sister, the healer goddess Airmed, stood over the king. They did not cut or hammer, they sang. They sang the song of the sinews, the chant of the bone, the low, pulsing verse of the blood. They set the arm to the shoulder, and under the power of their voices, the dead flesh and the living flesh began to recognize each other, to weave themselves together. They placed a sinew of a king and a sinew of a queen as a bridge, and the severed nerves sparked. The blood found its old, forgotten pathways, and the cold, pale flesh of the arm grew warm and pink. On the 3rd day, Nuada, who had lain in a deep, magical trance, opened his eyes. He looked at his shoulder. The silver arm was gone. In its place, pale and scarred, but undeniably his, was his own arm, the one he had lost to Shreng. He felt the itch in his palm. He slowly, miraculously, curled his fingers and made a fist of flesh and blood. He was, at last, whole. A cry of pure, stunned awe went up from the TDD. This was a magic beyond anything they had seen. It was not invention. It was resurrection. But in the center of this joy, one man stood in a cold, black shadow. Dian Secht, the master physician, the father of Miach, looked at his son, the man who had just performed a miracle he himself had deemed impossible. His own creation, the silver arm, was now just a piece of discarded metal. His son had not just surpassed him. He had rendered his greatest work obsolete, proven it to be a mere child's toy. A jealousy so profound, so cold and so heavy, it was like a Fomorian stone settled in his heart. This pride, this jealous rage of the old master for the new, consumed him. He confronted his son. In a fit of blind, unreasoning fury, he raised his own lorg, his heavy physician's staff, and struck Miach on the head. It was a skin wound, and Miach, stunned more by the act than the blow, simply placed a hand to his head, and with his innate gift, healed it. The skin knit. The bleeding stopped. This casual display of power only enraged Dian Secht more. "He is not dead," he roared, and he struck his son a second time, a terrible blow to the bone, splitting his skull. Miach fell to his knees, but again, with a pained, difficult effort, he sang the bone closed, healing himself. Dian Sesh, now a monster of his own pride, struck a third time, to the membrane of the brain. Miak, his life force ebbing, his healing songs growing weak, just managed to repair the damage, slumping exhausted. Dian Seisht, seeing his son still breathing, still a living testament to his own inferiority, raised his staff one last, final time. He struck him to the brain itself, and this Myak could not heal. The greatest healer in the history of the Tidadi fell, dead at his father's feet, murdered by the god of healing himself. A terrible sorrow settled on the land. Myak was buried, and from his grave a new tragic magic bloomed. 365 herbs, one for every joint, sinew, and nerve in the human body he had so perfectly understood, sprouted from his mound, their properties clear to see. His grieving sister, Airmed, came with her cloak and began to carefully, lovingly sort them, a perfect materia medica, her brother's last orderly gift to the world. But Dian Secht, his spite unburied, saw this. He stormed to the grave, and in a final terrible act of vandalism, he violently shook Airmed's cloak, scattering the herbs, mixing them all into a chaotic, hopeless jumble. And so, the old texts lament, no one on earth, not even the TDD, ever again knew the true, perfect cure for every ailment. For the jealousy of a father had destroyed his son's perfect knowledge, leaving all of medicine forever after a matter of guesswork and faith. The murder of Myak, a stain of tragic, familial jealousy, was the last dark chord of the old world. With his burial and the scattering of his perfect herbal knowledge by his own father, a line was drawn. The age of chaos, of settling, and of existential warfare was definitively over. Lugh Lamfada, the Samildanak, having avenged his grandfather's prophecy and secured the island from all external threats, now presided over a land that was for the first time truly and wholly theirs. The Tuatha Dé Danann, no longer invaders or defenders, could finally be what their nature had always intended, not just warriors, but an entire civilization of masters. And so began the Moray, the Great Age, a long golden period of peace, prosperity, and the full untrusideled flowering of divine dawn. Lugh's reign was unlike any that had come before. It was not the militaristic code of the Fir Bolg, nor the miserly extortion of Bress, nor even the maimed and interrupted regency of Nuada. Lugh, as the master of all arts, ruled by a principle of total, harmonious excellence. Under his gaze, the entire island became a kind of workshop, a studio, a university. The forge of Goibniu, which had once glowed with the red, hungry light of an endless war, now rang with a new, creative music. The divine smith, his skills no longer needed for spearheads that would never miss, now turned his art to the intricate, the beautiful, and the purely celebratory. He forged vast golden fitchel boards, the pieces inlaid with silver and rock crystal. He hammered out bronze drinking horns and cauldrons of such perfect form that a single note struck on their rim would sing for an hour. Credna, the brazier, no longer just a maker of rivets, now created jewelry so fine it was said to rival the iridescence of a dragonfly's wing, golden torques that held the light of the sun, and brooches that were microcosms of the entire balanced world. But the greatest flourishing was in the arts of the mind, the intangible dawn that Lugh himself most prized. Ogma, the champion, whose strength had been a bulwark against the Fomorians, now channeled his power into a more lasting creation. He is credited in this age with the invention of Ogham, the secret linear script of the Irish, where letters are represented by a series of lines and notches, each named for a different sacred tree. This was a script for druids and poets, a way to carve knowledge into wood and stone, a tangible magic that bound language to the land itself. The poets and Fali, men like Caerbre, who had exposed Brez with the power of a single, true verse, were now the most revered figures in the kingdom. Their satires feared as much as their praises were coveted. The great halls, including the rebuilt Tara, were filled not with the sound of clashing arms, but with the complex hypnotic strains of the harp and the rhythmic cadence of the Ard Fili, reciting the genealogies of the gods, weaving the past, present, and future into a single, seamless narrative. The crowning achievement of Lugh's reign, the very institution that defined this golden age, was his establishment of the Ainach Tailtean, the Great Assembly or Games of Tailtiu. This was not just a gesture of athletic pride, it was a profound act of personal, political, and spiritual love. It was founded in honor of his foster mother, Tailtiu, the last queen of the Fir Bolg, the one who had raised him in secret, nurturing the prophecy that would save them all. She had died, the stories say, from the exhaustion of clearing the Great Plains of Ireland for agriculture, a mythic, self-sacrificial act. To honor her, Lugh decreed an annual festival to be held at the time of the harvest, Lugh Nasad, the Assembly of Lughs, which we still call the 1st of August. This was not a funeral, but a celebration of life, law, and skill. For weeks the TDD would gather at Telltown. There were athletic games, of course, running, leaping, and chariot racing, but these were only a small part. There were contests of craft, where Goibniu, Credna, and Luchta would sit as judges. There were contests of poetry, of history, of music. It was here that new laws were proclaimed, disputes were settled, and great binding marriages were contracted. It was the total expression of LTUG's TDD society, a celebration of every dawn, a time when the entire civilization came together to see itself and to find itself good. Lugh ruled in this brilliant, sunlit manner for 40 years, a perfect creative generation. But his light, the light of the Samuldanach, was the brilliance of the high sun, a peak of focused, intellectual, and artistic fire. As his reign concluded, the myths are quiet on the details of its end, for such a perfect reign does not end, but completes. The kingship passed to the one being who could follow it. The crown settled upon the great, broad head of the Dagda, the Olathair, the Allfather. And with this, the mood of the Golden Age shifted not from light to dark, but from the bright, clear fire of the intellect to the deep, warm, generative heat of the earth. The Dagda's reign was one of profound, rolling, earthy abundance. The central image of the kingdom was no longer the Fitchel board or the Ogham stone. It was his Coir Dagde, the cauldron of plenty, which now stood at the heart of Tara, from which no one, of any rank, ever went away hungry. This was the era where the secret of the harvest, bought with the life of Brez, bore its fullest fruit. The fields were heavy with grain, the cows always in milk, just as Bray had falsely promised, but this was a true, natural bounty, regulated by the music of the Dagda's harp, Waithne, which he played to order the seasons, to make the land itself happy. It was also in this age of deep, generative power that the Dagda's own complex family came to define the pantheon. It was he who, in a famous mythic tryst, desired the goddess Boan. To hide their union from her husband, Elkmar, the Dagda sent Elkmar on a one-day journey, but he cast a spell, a Tyr in Tyringir, land of promise magic, that made the sun stand still in the sky. For Elkmar, it was a single day. For the Dagda and Boan, it was 9 months, in which their son, Angus, the Mac Og, or young son, the god of youth, love, and poetic inspiration, was conceived and born. This act, bending time itself for the sake of love, was the ultimate symbol of the TDD's golden age, a time when reality itself was as fluid and as beautiful as their art. The golden age, under the warm, earthy, and abundant rule of the Dagda, was not a static, timeless dream. It was a long, slow afternoon of divine civilization. The choir Dagda was always full. The harp Uathan always played the correct seasonal music, and the children of the TDD, like the god Angus Og, lived in a world where time itself could be bent for the sake of poetry and love. The Tuatha Dé Danann had become so completely synonymous with the land of Ireland that it was impossible to tell where their divine nature ended and the green, fertile hills began. They were not just ruling the island, they had become its operating system, its very soul. And in this perfect, self-contained world, their reign felt as if it must be eternal, as permanent as the sun. But the men who wrote their stories, the medieval monks, knew that this could not be. History, in their Christian worldview, was not a cycle, but a line, a single purposeful narrative arrow pointing toward their own human present. For them to be the rightful, God-given masters of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé could not be the final chapter. The gods had to fall. And so, into the Labor Gabala Aaron, the great book of the takings, the monks wrote the last and greatest of the 5 invasions. This one would be different. It was not a chaotic, monstrous force like the Fomorians, nor a simple earthy people like the Firbolg. The final invaders were, in the monks' careful euhemerism, simply people. They were the Goidels, the Gaels, the direct, unblemished, and wholly human ancestors of the very men writing the stories. They were called the Milesians, the sons of Mil Espine, or the soldier of Spain, a name that itself was a brilliant piece of medieval invention, a manufactured lineage designed to connect the wild, isolated island of Ireland to the grand, respected, and classical world of the Mediterranean. Mil himself was a Scythian warrior, a wandering hero who, in these crafted genealogies, had traveled the known world, Greece, Egypt, before his family settled in the warm, dry lands of Iberia, the land we now call Spain and Portugal. From this land, their final journey began. The origin of their mission, the spark that lit the fire of this final conquest, is a moment of pure, evocative mystery. According to the Labor Gabala, a Milesian chieftain named Eth, or in other versions, the great poet-seer Amergin, climbed a vast tower on the northern coast of Spain, a place that scholars have long and lovingly associated with the Torre de Hercule, the Tower of Hercules. This is a real, tangible object, an ancient Roman lighthouse, a stone sentinel that has stood for nearly 2,000 years, looking out over the same vast, cold, and empty stretch of the Atlantic. The myth states that on a clear, sharp winter's day, when the air was as clean and thin as glass, Eth looked out from the top of this tower. He gazed past the horizon, his sight supernaturally keen, and there, in the farthest unimaginable distance, a place where no land should be, He saw it. A faint, green, beautiful smudge, a shadowy isle, a promise. He had, the poets say, seen Innisfail, the Isle of Destiny. This vision became their prophecy. This was their promised land, the home that fate had reserved for them. They were a people who had been wandering according to their own legends since the days of the flood, and now they finally had a destination. A great fleet was assembled, a human armada, powered not by mist or magic, but by oar and sail and a burning human resolve. They were led not by a king like Nuada, nor a polymath like Lugh, but by a figure who was in his own way a perfect synthesis of all their power. This was Amergin Glewingle, White Knee, the great poet, druid, and judge. He was the Samaldonic of the mortal world, a man whose power was not in his sword arm, but in his word. He understood, in a way the Tuired would soon be forced to, that the final contest for a magical land would not be a battle of steel, but a battle of songs, a contest of divine, legal, and poetic jurisdiction. The TDD, in their golden age, were not unaware. Their own druids, their Fythi, had seen this in their visions. They had foretold the arrival of a new race, a final people, and that this arrival would mean the end of their own. But they had grown comfortable in their divinity. And so, when the warning cries finally came from the sentries on the southern coast, on the 1st of May, Beltane, the exact symmetrical anniversary of the TDD's own arrival, it was a profound shock. They looked out to sea and saw not the darky, magical clouds of their own landing, but a vast, terrifying, and mundane fleet of wooden ships, their sails painted, their decks glinting with the bronze and iron of 1,000 mortal warriors. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of the land, were being invaded by humanity. The long, slow afternoon of their reign was over. The twilight had come, and the sons of Meal, their poet-leader Amergin standing in the prow of the lead ship, were about to make landfall, their feet ready to claim the soil of the island that had been promised to them. The final taking of Ireland was about to begin. The fleet of the Milesians, a vast wooden crescent, grated upon the southern sands of Ireland on the high feast of Beltane, a symmetry of arrivals that was not lost on the divine inhabitants who watched from the hills. But this landing was not met with the dark, concealing mists of the Tuatha Dé Danann's own arrival. It was met with a clear, sharp, and challenging sunlight. At the head of the mortal host, his feet the first to touch the sacred soil at Inberskeen, was Amergin Glewingle, the poet, the judge, the druid, the man who was the Samildonic of his own human race. He did not draw a sword. He did not issue a challenge. He simply stood, his face turned to the breeze coming off the land, and he spoke. He performed the first and greatest act of poetic claiming in the island's history, the famous Song of Amergin. He did not ask for the land. He declared his identity with it. I am the wind upon the sea. His voice rang out. I am the wave of the ocean. I am the tear of the sun. I am the point of the spear that thirsts for battle. I am the god who shapes in the head the fire. He was not just an invader. He was a new consciousness, a human consciousness, claiming a connection to the island's essence as deep and as total as that of the TDD themselves. It was a legal and magical gauntlet, thrown not at the TDD's armies, but at their very right to exist. The Tuatha Dé Danann, watching from Tara, heard this song on the wind and knew that this was not a Fomorian raid. This was an ending. But they were still the gods, and the land was still theirs. The Milesians, led by Amergin, began their march inland, a procession moving toward the island's heart, toward the seat of power at Tara. And as they marched, the land itself, in its divine feminine personification, rose up to meet them. They had not traveled far before they came to a high hill, Sliab Mis, and there, waiting for them, was a woman of dazzling supernatural beauty, her bearing that of a queen, her eyes holding the ancient green light of the land. She was surrounded by her own retinue of magical beings, and she blocked the path of the entire Milesian army. This was Banba, one of the 3 sister queens of the Tuatha Dé Danann. She was the wife of Mac Cuil, one of the 3 ruling kings, a grandson of the Dagda. She greeted Amergin not with fear, but with a sovereign's curiosity. She asked his name and his purpose, and Amergin, with the force of a judge, declared that they, the sons of Miel, had come to take this land, their fated inheritance. Banba looked at the host, at their iron weapons, and their mortal, determined faces. She did not, it seems, have the power to stop them, for prophecy was on their side. She had only one request. "If you are to be successful," she said, her voice like the wind in the barley, "then let this island be called by my name, in my honor, forever." Amergin, bound by his own code of truth and justice, and recognizing the divinity before him, bowed and gave his word. The first contract was made. The army marched on, deeper into the island, and they came to a second great hill, a place of power. And there, as if in a destined echo, a second queen stood waiting, as beautiful and as regal as the first. This was Fodla, the second sister, wife of the king Maxect. The same ritual unfolded. She challenged their purpose, and Amergin declared their unshakable destiny. Fodla, like her sister, saw the truth of his claim, the unstoppable tide of this new human age, and she too made the same single request. "Let this land, if you win it, be named for me. Let my name be its name forever." And Amergin, the just poet, agreed. The second contract was sealed. The Milesians were not just conquering a physical place, they were being woven, name by name, into its very identity, its poetic and divine fabric. This triplicate goddess, this 3-faced queen, is one of the deepest and most persistent truths in Celtic mythology, the very personification of the land's sovereignty. A king could not take Ireland. He had to be chosen by her, to marry her, to be her rightful husband. Amergin, by honoring her 3 forms, was passing this ancient ritual test. Finally, the Milesians came to the high, sacred, central place of Ireland, the hill of Usneek, the mythological axis mundi of the island. And here, the third and greatest of the sisters waited. This was Eriu. She was the wife of the 3rd king, Mac Grain, and she was the truest, deepest, and most potent soul of the land. She did not greet them with the regal calm of her sisters. She met them with a flash of fire and prophecy. She was surrounded by her own Badby or war goddesses, her aspect terrible and beautiful. She too demanded their purpose. But when Amergin spoke, she did not just acquiesce. She prophesied. She declared that this land would belong to them, the Goidels, and that from this sea-girt peak, no better island will be found, and your race will be here until the end of the world. Her words were a confirmation, but also a lament, an act of abdication. And then, her voice softening, she made her request, the one that mattered most. "My name," she said, "is Eriu. I ask that this island be called by my name, and it shall be its chief name forever." Amergin, his journey complete, raised his staff. He had met the threefold soul of the land, and he had honored it. He declared that it would be so. "This land," he proclaimed, "shall be called Eir." And it is this name above Banba and Fodla that remains its primary name in the Irish tongue to this day, a permanent, living fulfillment of a mythological promise. Now, with the land's spiritual permission secured, the Milesians marched on to Tara. Here they met the three kings, Mac Quill, McSect, and Mac Grain, the temporal male power of the TDD. The kings, seeing that their wives, the very land itself, had already granted the Milesians their right, could not declare an immediate war. They were bound by the TDD's own high laws of justice. They challenged Amergin, not as a warrior, but as a judge. "You have not taken this land justly," they argued. "You landed by stealth, with magic. We demand that you submit to a ruling." Amergin, trapped by his own identity as a just arbiter, had to agree. The TDD kings laid out their terms. The Milesians must leave the island. They must return to their ships and row back from the shore a specific magical distance, the distance of Naui Tona, the 9 waves. This was the liminal legal boundary of Ireland, a space that was neither land nor sea. From that distance they were to attempt a new, fair landing in the light of day. If the TDD, with all their magic, could prevent them, the claim was void. If the Milesians could, despite their arts, set foot on the shore again, the island was theirs, by law, by poetry, and by right of conquest. Amergin, his face set like stone, accepted the judgment, even though it was against him. He turned his vast mortal army around. They marched silently back to their ships and began to row, counting the great, green, rolling waves, putting their entire destiny into the hands of the sea. The Milesians, their faces hard with salt and grim resolve, bent to their oars, pulling their great wooden ships away from the shore of their promised land. They were obeying the letter of the law, the judgment of their own poet king Amergin, and the wily, desperate challenge of the Tuatha Dé Danann. They rowed, counting the great, green, rolling swells, until the land was a thin, dark line behind them, and they had passed the magical, liminal boundary of the Naui Tona, the 9 waves. They were now in the outsea, in the legal and magical territory of the open ocean, poised for their second fair attempt. And it was in this moment, with the mortal fleet arrayed and vulnerable, that the Tuatha Dé Danann, from their high hills, unleashed the full, terrible, and desperate power of their dawn. This was not a war of steel, it was a war of magic. The Tidai, led by their 3 kings, Mac Quill, McSect, and Mac Grain, raised their arms to the sky, and their druids began to chant. They did not summon a simple squall. They invoked a Gaoth Dryochta, a druidical wind, a storm that was not of nature, but of will. The clear Beltane sky was suddenly unnaturally blotted out. A fog of the TDD rolled over the water, a thick, sightless, and magical mist. The sea, which had been calm, heaved, and rose in a single, monstrous, unseasonable rage. The very waves that the Milesians had so carefully counted now turned against them, rising up as vast green liquid mountains, their tops white-topped with a fury that was not wind, but pure, concentrated, divine resistance. The Milesian fleet, a collection of mere wood and sinew, was instantly broken. The storm had no pattern. It was pure chaos, a conscious entity designed to scatter, to drown, and to annihilate. Masts, as thick as ancient trees, cracked and splintered like twigs. The shouts of the mortal warriors were swallowed by the roar of the magical wind. Ships were swamped, overturned, and smashed against each other, the dream of a new kingdom dissolving into the cold, churning Atlantic. The TDD, watching from the shore, must have believed their magic had held. They had used the very ocean, the boundary of their world, as their ultimate weapon. But they had not counted on the power of their opponent's Dan. In the lead ship, which pitched and groaned on the edge of oblivion, its oar bank shattered, Amergian Glewingle stood at the prow, his white-robed figure a stark contrast to the black, magical sky. He was not just a poet. He was a druid of a new and perhaps more potent order. He recognized the storm not as weather, but as magic. He saw the fog of the TDD and knew he was in a duel of will. Planting his feet on the heaving deck, he raised his own druid's staff, and he did not chant against the storm. He chanted to the land. He invoked Ireland itself, appealing over the heads of the TDD to the deep, elemental soul of the island he had promised to honor. "I invoke the land of Ireland," he cried, his voice cutting through the gale. "I invoke the shining sea. I invoke the seven heights. I invoke the rivers. I invoke the very earth." It was a legal and poetic counterspell, a binding oath that reminded the land of the promises its own queens, Eriu, Banba, and Fodla had made. He was holding the very island to its contract, and the land, hearing its true names, its own essence, invoked by this new, mortal but truthful voice, responded. The druidical wind faltered. The magical, unnatural element of the storm died, leaving only a natural, albeit terrible, gale. But the price of this landing had already been paid in blood. The storm, though its magic was broken, had been lethal. The Milesian fleet was decimated. One of the chief leaders, Don, a brother of the new kings, was lost. His ship dashed upon a rocky, desolate island. As he drowned, he cursed his brothers, and that bleak rock would forever be known as Tech Dwyn, the House of Dawn, a place that would become, in the Irish mind, the new, dark resting place for the souls of the dead. The Milesians had not just conquered the land, they had brought mortality to it, and their first act was to create a home for their own dead, battered, diminished, but with their will forged to the hardness of iron by their sacrifice. The surviving ships, led by the sons of Miel, Aramon, and Aberfin, finally fought their way through the surf and landed, for the second and final time, at the mouth of the River Boyne, the very heart of the TDD's magical landscape. The spell was broken. The judgment was fulfilled. The Milesians marched inland, no longer as petitioners, but as avengers, their hearts hardened by the TDD's treachery. The divine race, their greatest magic having failed them, were in profound shock. They had been matched and beaten at their own game. The final meeting was not one of magic, but of steel and of fate. The two armies met at Tailtew, the very site where Lugh had founded his games, the sacred, celebratory heart of the TDD's golden age. Here, the last terrible and physical battle was joined. The TDD fought with the desperate, beautiful, and failing light of a dying age. Their three kings, Mac Quill, Mac Sect, and Mac Grain, led the line, but the Milesians fought with the unyielding, terrible strength of destiny. The prophecy of Eriu, that this land would belong to the Goidels, was now a self-fulfilling ironclad doom. The battle was a bloody, grinding rout. The three kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann were slain, and in the greatest, most profound tragedy of the day, their three queens, Eriu, Banba, and Fodla, the living, breathing sovereignty of the land, were also cut down, killed on the field of their own honor. With their deaths, the land's divine soul was severed. The Tuatha were broken, kingless, queenless, and their magic, for the first time, had proven insufficient against the simple, unbending will of human history. The age of gods was over. The age of men had begun. The battle of Tuired was over, and the silence that fell upon the plain was heavier and more final than any that had followed the wars against the Firbolg or the Fomorians. This was not the quiet of victory, but the profound, echoing hush of an epic's end. The divine dead lay upon the field of their own harvest games, and among them were the three queens, Eriu, Banba, and Fodla, the land's own living, breathing soul. With their deaths, the sovereignty of Ireland was broken, its divine contract with the Tuatha Dé Danann shattered, and the island, for the first time, was just a place, a prize of raw, mortal conquest, claimed by the iron weapons and unbending human will of the Milesians. The surviving Tuatha, a scattered, kingless, and queenless host, retreated to the hills, their shining light dimmed, their hearts broken by a force they could not magically repel, their own fated replacement. The Milesians, led by their two new kings, the brothers Aramon and Aber Finn, and advised by their great poet judge, Amergine Glúingel, were now the undisputed masters of the upper world. They had won the island by the sword, and by the word, and by the law. But as they began to survey their new kingdom, they were faced with a profound and troubling reality. They had conquered the land, but they had not conquered its magic. The surviving Tuatha, though defeated, were still gods. They were still the masters of the dawn, and in their grief and rage, they were not a vanquished foe, but a lethal, supernatural insurgency. They did not gather for a new battle. They simply began to unmake the new, mortal world that had been built on top of theirs. The corn that the Milesians planted, using the very knowledge they had won from Bress, was blighted, blasted by a magical withering wind. The milk in their pails curdled overnight. Their children were taken by sudden, wasting sicknesses, and their cattle, the source of all mortal wealth, fell dead in the fields, untouched by any visible spear. The TDD, in their defeat, had become a hostile nobility of the shadows, waging a guerrilla war of magic, a campaign of souring and blighting and sickening. The Milesian kings quickly understood that it was impossible to rule a land whose divine soul was actively and invisibly trying to kill them. They had won the body of Ireland, but its spirit was in open, magical rebellion. It was Amergin, the poet-judge, the man of contracts, who knew that this final, bloody conquest was not enough. The war had to be concluded, not with a victory, but with a treaty. A final, binding peace had to be made, a partitioning of reality itself. He, as the chief druid of the Milesians, summoned the last great leaders of the Tuatha Dé Danann to a council, not at Tara, but at a liminal place between the worlds. The Dagda, his reign over the Golden Age now a bitter memory, came as the Olathair, the All-Father, the spokesman for a defeated race. With him were the survivors, Lugh, his brilliance now a cold, hard light, Goibniu, his hands no longer needed for a forge, and Manannan Mac Lir, the god of the sea, who as a being of the boundary, saw this new division most clearly. Amergine laid out his terms, and they were the terms of a poet, not a tyrant. He proposed a division of Ireland, not in half, as the Tí Dí had once offered the Fir Bolg, but a division of its very nature. "You are the people of the dawn," he said, his voice the voice of the new law. "Your time in the sun is over, for this is now the age of men who must toil for their grain and live their short, mortal lives. But your own nature is not mortal." He offered them not exile, but concealment. The Milesians, he declared, would take the upper half of Ireland, the world that is seen, the soil that is plowed, the wind that is felt, the daylight, and the linear historical time. The Tuatha Dé Danann, in exchange for a permanent peace, in exchange for removing their curse from the corn and the cattle, would be given the other half. They would be given the world within. They would be the masters of the under half of Ireland, the invisible, the magical, the eternal. Their new kingdom would not be a place of exile, but a parallel dimension, a world hidden inside the physical land. And their palaces, their points of entry, would be the most ancient and sacred places in all of Ireland, the Síde. These were the great Neolithic passage tombs, Bruna Boyne, Newgrange, Connaughba, Noth, and Dubad, Douth, the vast hollow hills, already thousands of years old, which the Celts looked upon with a deep, reverent awe. The monks in this tale were performing their greatest act of euhemerism. They were explaining the unexplainable. They were giving the ancient pre-Celtic monuments a new, profound purpose. They were not just tombs, they were the palaces of the gods. The Dagda, the great, earthy god, saw the wisdom. It was a perfect, tragic, and brilliant solution. They would not be leaving Ireland. They would be retreating into its very heart. They would trade the visible world for eternal life, for the preservations of their magic, and for a new kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty of the dream, the unseen, the other world. The treaty was struck. The Dagda, as the new hidden king, was given the task of partitioning this new kingdom. He became the great distributor, assigning each of the remaining TDD nobility their own seeds. To Lugh's he gave a great mound, to Ogma another. To Manannan Mac Lir he affirmed his dominion over the sea, the ultimate liminal space. And for his own son, Angus Og, the god of love, he secured the greatest palace of all, the Brú na Bóinne itself, by a clever poetic trick. The pact was sealed, the magic was bound, the curses on the corn and cattle were lifted. And then, as the Milesians watched from a distance, the last act of the divine drama unfolded. The survivors of the Tuatha Dé Danann, their forms still shining, their beauty a thing that broke the hearts of the mortal men who saw it, gathered at the entrances to the great mounds. As the sun set, they did not die. They did not sail away. They simply turned and walked one by one into the cold stone entrances of the ancient hills. As the last of them, perhaps the Dagda himself, passed from the twilight into the earth, the light from within the seed faded, and the great carved stones became just stones once more. The mist, the CEO Dry Oshta, rolled in. not as a weapon, but as a veil, separating the world of men from the world of the gods forever. The Tuatha Dé Danann were gone, and yet they were everywhere. And so, the great, shining, and divine race, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the masters of all dawn, vanished from the sight of mortal men. They did not die in that last, fated battle at Tuatha. They were not driven into the sea like the Fomorians, nor did they sail away to a distant western land. They were instead translated, abiding by the Pact of Amergin, the great final treaty that had partitioned not the land, but reality itself. They had exchanged the upper half of the world of the sun, the plow, and the short, hard human life, for the under half, the eternal, unseen, and magical world that existed parallel to it, hidden behind the thinnest of veils. They walked into the cold stone of the ancient hollow hills, the Side, and in doing so, they passed from history, from the careful, euhemerized chronicles of the monks, and back into the pure, timeless, and potent realm of the divine. They ceased to be the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, and they became something new, something more mysterious, and in time, something far more personal to the people who lived above them. They became the Aosi, the people of the mounds. Their defeat was, in this strange, poetic way, their ultimate preservation. By losing the final war, they escaped the brutal, linear finality of mortal history. They were no longer subject to the iron and the ore, to the succession of kings and the failing of flesh. They had retreated into the Tuired in Tuired, the land of promise, a world that was now all around the mortal Irish, coexisting in the same space, yet on a different frequency. Their palaces, the side of themselves, Newgrange, Noth, Douth, and 1,000 other smaller mounds, became the entry points, the portals to this other world. The ancient pre-Celtic passage tombs, which the Milesians looked upon with uncomprehending awe, were now fully explained. They were not just the graves of forgotten giants, they were the living, breathing, and sometimes dangerous palaces of the new hidden neighbors. The light that floods the chamber of Bruna Boine on the winter solstice was no longer just an astronomical alignment. It was the light from Angus Ogg's hall, a brief annual crack in the door between the two worlds. This new relationship between humanity and the Aosi was one defined by careful, wary respect. The gods were no longer rulers to be worshipped. They were a power to be propitiated. They became the good neighbors, the gentry, the fair folk, names spoken with a carefully cultivated politeness, for to call them by their true names was to draw their attention, and their attention was as dangerous as it was beautiful. The old festivals, which Lugh had established in his golden age, now took on a new, more urgent meaning. The 2 days of the year when the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest, Beltane on the 1st of May, when the TDD had first arrived, and Samhain on the 1st of November, were now the most perilous. On these nights, the Sada were said to be open, their magical inhabitants free to walk in the mortal world, and mortal men, if they were unwary, could be taken, lured into the timeless, beautiful, and soul-destroying halls of the mounds, from which they might return 100 years later, or not at all. And so, the people of Ireland, the mortal descendants of the Milesians, continued to leave offerings, a quiet folk memory of a divine contract, a bowl of milk left on the doorstep, A portion of butter left at the foot of a fairy tree, or a rath's, a lone, unplowed hawthorn, was not a gift to a sprite. It was a continuation of the tribute once paid to the gods, a small act of peace to ensure the Sea would not blight the corn or sour the milk, just as they had done in that first magical war. The great gods themselves, in this new, muffled world, began to fade, their epic continental stories shrinking over the centuries into local, specific, and folkloric tales. The Dagda, the great earthy Olathair, his club that could kill and restore, his cauldron that could feed the world, was slowly diminished. His name was forgotten, and he was remembered as the Goodman, the guardian of the seed, or in a final tragic refraction as a Clurichan or leprechaun, a solitary subterranean craftsman, his great cauldron of plenty shrunk to a single hidden pot of gold. The other gods faded in kind. Goibniu, the divine smith who had forged an endless supply of perfect, lethal spears, became the Goban Saur, the legendary local Sita smith, the one who could be called upon to mend a broken plow in a way no mortal smith could. And the Morrigan, the great phantom queen, the Badbo who had washed the armor of the slain and shrieked as a crow over the epic, nation-defining slaughter of Mag Tuired, she too was transformed. Her vast cosmic terror was personalized. She was no longer the goddess of war, but the goddess of death in the family. She became the Bean Sea, the woman of the mound, the banshee, her cry no longer a call to battle, but a localized, personal, and terrible lament, a warning that death was coming to a specific human house. She was the last, grieving echo of the old divinity, still bound in her faded way to the destiny of the Irish people. The Tuatha Dé Danann, in the end, did not lose. They had simply changed. They had sacrificed their history to secure their immortality, trading the world of the sun for the world of the soul. They remain there, even now, in the scholarly texts that preserved them, and in the green, hollow hills that still hold their light. They are the sleeping kings, the hidden magic, the Sea, a presence as real and as unseen as the wind, a quiet, final reminder that the land, no matter who claims to rule it, always remembers its gods.